Good afternoon. If we could get our roundtable presenters at the table, and we are so delighted to have you all here. I'm Hilda Legg, the State Director for USDA Rural Development here in the wonderful Commonwealth of Kentucky. You have taken your time to come out on this beautiful spring day in Berea to talk to us about an issue that is so important to our communities across the Commonwealth and across the nation. You are here from numerous states, and we have a very good program that we hope when you leave here today, you will go home motivated to make even more difference in your communities as we address the opioid crisis. As a native Kentuckian and proud to be a Kentuckian, I knew we had a problem, but I didn't know how bad it was until our Assistant to the Secretary, Hazlett, gave me a list of 220 counties nationally that were considered in distress. Now, ladies and gentlemen, thinking about that, 220 across 50 states. Guess how many were in Kentucky? 54. 54 of the 220 nationally of counties that were in distress were in our own Commonwealth. And so it is a much more pervasive and devastating and non-socioeconomically determined crisis than I had even realized. And so I was very honored when our Assistant Secretary Hazlett chose Kentucky as one of the 5 national roundtables to be held to discuss this important subject. So today we will get on with the program because you are here to hear from these experts. But Anne, I want to offer you my personal thanks for taking the time to come from Washington, spend time for 2 days here in the Commonwealth, meet with our people, talk to our recovering addicts, and take a personal interest in our Commonwealth. We're so pleased to have you here. We also want to, yes, give her a round of applause. Absolutely. One of the things that Anne focuses on is what we call IPI, and it's infrastructure, partnerships, and innovation. And we have wonderful partners. I'm not going to call them by name, but ask them to stand. We have representatives from Senator Mitch McConnell's office, Senator Rand Paul's office, Congressman Barr's office, Congressman Guthrie's office, and Congressman Comer's office. Please thank them for the work they do on the national level to help us. And it's really great to have all of you here. We are in the 6th Congressional District, and we will be hearing shortly from our congressman. So Berea is in sort of the heart of Kentucky, and we think this is at the heart of issues that impact our rural communities. And so there are so many of you could be at this table. There are so many wonderful projects in our Commonwealth, so many voices, and it was difficult to narrow the ones that could sit around the table today. But let me take a moment just to introduce them for you. We have Shelley Ellswick and her son Alex as president and co-founder of Voices for Hope. We have our governor, also a medical doctor and many other wonderful things, but representing Recovery Kentucky, Governor Ernie Fletcher. We have David Gross, who is the Administrative Director for Education and Research at St. Clair Healthcare. Tim Robinson, a recovering addict, but a founder and CEO of Addiction Recovery Care. Dan Mosley, a local elected official. We know our communities are devastated by that. He's our county judge executive in Harlan County. Patrick Winthrow, and he's got more initials behind his name in the medical world, but he is the director of outreach for Baptist Health came all the way, thank you, Dr. Withrow, from Paducah, Kentucky, down on the river. We have my friend Judge David Tapp. He is the 28th Judicial Circuit Court judge in the Kentucky court system. Tom Handy, longtime friend, chairman of Operation Unite, Congressman Rogers' project. We also have April Young. I want her to raise her hand because Dr. Young has been leading a program called Care to Hope that you're going to hear about with the University of Kentucky, but she's been so active in that program she's lost her voice, so being willing to sit in at the last minute is Dr. Carrie Oser, so we appreciate Carrie you being willing to do that, and Dr. Young for being here. Danielle Franklin, the Director of Community Development from Highlands Health System. Jeff Howard, our commissioner from the Kentucky Department for Public Health. Jeff Schote, who is our leader and former founder of the Foothills Academy. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, Congressman Barr was unable to join us, but he took time to put together a short video to share with us. So at this time, would you listen to the welcome by Congressman Andy Barr, 6th Congressional District.
Hello, this is Congressman Andy Barr. Even though I have to be in Washington today to vote, it is a pleasure to have the opportunity to welcome Anne Hazlett, the Assistant to the Secretary for Rural Development at the USDA, to the 6th District of Kentucky. Again, I'm sorry I can't be in person with you, but I want to thank you for taking the time to join this roundtable, and I would like to recognize Hilda Legg for her outstanding leadership as Kentucky's Rural Development State Director. I would also like to thank Secretary Perdue and Anne Hazlett and the entire team at USDA for recognizing the devastating impact of the nation's opioid crisis on our families and our communities, and their commitment to ensuring rural areas have the resources they need to combat this epidemic. Last October, President Trump declared the opioid epidemic as a national public health emergency, and ever since, Congress has worked diligently to support policies that increase treatment and prevention initiatives, improve law enforcement efforts, and stop the flow of illegal drugs into our country. In 2016, I was proud to support the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act and the 21st Century Cures Act, both of which provided resources and programs to combat the opioid epidemic. And more recently, I was proud to support a $4 billion investment, the largest to date, to address the opioid epidemic in the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which was signed into law in March. This legislation also included an amendment I offered to increase funding for the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Areas Program. Specifically, it funded the program at $280 million, a $26 million increase over fiscal year 2017. While no single federal bill can stop this crisis, it's incumbent upon all of us to continue working together to make progress in fighting this drug crisis so that more Kentuckians can lead productive and meaningful lives free from addiction. With that, I want to thank you all for your time, your input, and dedication to finding solutions to combat and ultimately solve this national emergency.
We'd like to thank Congressman Barr for his leadership in this area and for hosting us along with Berea College for this third of 5 national USDA roundtables. There are a couple other folks that I do want to highlight. When I came on this job, and just a few months ago, I thought I was going to be doing infrastructure and projects. Little did I know that I was going to be in the midst of this opioid crisis where we are battling it daily. What I did know was my very own Congressman Hal Rogers, and I wanted to recognize his district director, Karen Kelly, is here. I saw her earlier. I know she's here for his leadership role because I knew about Unite, and they have been gracious and included our assistant to the secretary in their national conference. And so, again, for that early leadership in this project. Also, in talking about partnerships, I mentioned we have a very special guest from Atlanta, and she is Renee Elmers, the Regional Director of Region 4 for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So it's a special greeting to you for being here, and Secretary Hazlett was just insistent that we have you at our table to talk with us, so we're delighted that you're here. We in Kentucky have strong leadership on our state and our state offices as well. And so here to open our program today and to give us sort of a state of the Commonwealth, if you will, we have our very own Secretary for Justice and Public Safety, John Tilley. Secretary Tilley was appointed to this cabinet-level position by Governor Matt Bevin. He is a native of Hopkinsville, Kentucky. He is a former prosecutor and served 5 times in the Kentucky House of Representatives. He also chaired the House Judiciary Committee from 2009 until this appointment. During his legislative tenure, he co-chaired the several joint bipartisan House and Senate task forces on criminal justice. Secretary Tilley has also led efforts to combat synthetic and prescription drugs. Secretary Tilley, we are delighted, and if you would come to the podium and give us our State of the Commonwealth overview, and ladies and gentlemen, give a warm welcome to our Secretary. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, the first thing I'm going to do is make certain that I don't run over my allotted time. Hilda would not appreciate that, nor would you. So I'm going to open the phones are amazing things most of the time. Most of the time, I'd rather throw it in the river down by Paducah, Doctor. So I'm going to set my stopwatch so that I'm exactly off at 9 minutes now and 50 seconds as I use the first 10. Hilda, thank you for having me. I'm honored that you chose me to set the stage, however grim it may be. I also want to thank Hilda. She mentioned not having expected to be immersed in this kind of work, but as I was telling my wife why USDA this morning, as I go over, we're walking our kids to school this morning, which is one of the most amazing things I get to do. But in talking with her, she said, "Why is USDA involved?" And we began to talk about that, and she said, "Well, what kind of experiences do they have in this field? I thought they did these things." Well, that's a legitimate question. What Hilda has done, though, is immerse herself by talking to, I know, many of you, because she spent a lot of time with our office. Van Ingram, who's long time, you're on your third governor now, Governor Fletcher. Did you expect Van Ingram to still be sitting where he is sitting after you appointed him all those years ago, right? Well, he is, a resource we cannot do without, having that much experience. So I know, Hilda, you spent some time, and Rick Sanders, having spent his career in the DEA and then as a police chief and now our state police commissioner. I'll get to the things we're doing at the state police in response to how grim this picture has become, although there is light at the end of this tunnel as we are beginning to see. So I'll end with some hope. Let me start with that. So where are we? Where are we as a state? Well, let me share with you that the first time I met this governor was discussing this job. We had a meeting, what was to be the first of 3 long meetings about what he saw as the future of criminal justice and drug policy and everything we do in justice and what it affects. But the very first time I met him, he had something under his arm. Many of you have heard me say this before, but go with me on this. It's important. He had a copy of the book Dreamland under his arm. And he asked me if I'd read it. And I've often thought that if I had not read it, I probably wouldn't be standing before you today. We discussed it for the next 30 minutes. If you've not read it, and I know many of you in this room have, I think it's beyond just a good book. I think it's a textbook that explains why we're here today. What does that mean to Kentucky? We've lost more people, as you know, nationally by last count to overdose deaths in 1 year than we lost in the entire tenure of the Vietnam War. Now let that sink in for a minute. It's a self-inflicted plague. Kentucky, last count, 1,404 deaths was our last official count. That's from 2016. We're still counting for 2017. That will change. I will tell you some glimmer of hope. The last 2 quarters where we've looked at overdose deaths, we've seen a decrease. We don't think that will equate to one over the entire year. However, we do think that maybe that signals something good for us in this state, that maybe we're hitting that crest, Tim. I'm not certain. But let's cross our fingers and also let's pray, as we all have been. What does it mean to our state in other areas besides the health of our people? Well, what hasn't it meant? It means that today we have 25,000 people in prison. In 1972, we had 3,000 people in prison. We're 9th in the country in per capita incarceration. We're climbing back where we climbed out of that top 10. Heartbreakingly, we're 2nd in the number of females, the number of women who are in prison. Now keep this in mind. This is in a country that comprises 5% of the world's population, yet houses 25% of its prisoners. We have more children in this state who have or have had an incarcerated parent than any other state in the country. Right now, again, that female population is rising at 5 times the rate of our male population, which is growing. This is at a time when most states were seeing surging state inmate populations, but yet they've pulled back, they've instituted reforms. Now 38 states have seen a decrease, some modest, some more than modest, 38 states, and seen their crime drop. So what would you attribute to this problem of mass incarceration? Drugs, maybe? I think so. We have more kids in foster care than we've ever had in this state. There are 33,000 children, as I stand before you, affected by this pandemic. What is it? What is the CDC, which I really appreciate the work of the CDC, but by last count, somebody correct me, it's not been termed a pandemic yet, right? It's still an epidemic. But I looked up the definition a couple of years ago because I feel it's a pandemic. A disease prevalent over a whole country. Does that not meet the definition? So when you hear me call it a pandemic, I do so intentionally. I believe it is a pandemic. So what do we do about it? Since, the last decade, we've increased treatment in corrections by over 1,400%. Efforts like Tim's and others, we began to partner with the private sector, with Medicaid, and with this administration's 1115 waiver. Let me be clear about Governor Bevin's attempt and success at getting this 1115 waiver. Direct questions to Van Ingram on it specifically. He allowed me to stand away at a distance instead of being dragged into those daily meetings. I would not want to tell you the grind that it was to get this waiver, which will impact us in a very positive way. It will get people more treatment. We'll knock the cap off that 16-bed limit. We'll have residential treatment for those well over 100 at the end of the day. Right, Van? I could go on about how impactful that will be. I could talk about the change in culture in policing and law enforcement and bringing a guy with vision like Rick Sanders, who's on the Unite board as well, talking about the problem, setting up the country's first statewide Angel Initiative, where someone suffering with this substance use disorder, with this opioid disorder, can walk into a state police post. Now think about this 10 years ago. Throw down paraphernalia, throw down the drug, throw themselves down and say, find me help, and we'll guarantee them a bed or that help they need. That's transformative, and that's happening. We've redesigned reentry to the point, again, we take ideas to the governor, essentially asking him to allow us to blow things up and start over. And he says, yes, do it. Urgency is what, again, is dictating what we do. Time is not a luxury we have. So let me tell you, when we inherited reentry, I asked the folks in reentry, I said, how many have you connected to a job, housing, transportation? They had some of those other things lined out. How many jobs, which is key to this, getting people back to work, the dignity of work, something the governor wanted to focus on, something we wanted to focus on in justice. They said zero. Zero. This reentry division, which had been running since 2009. So now, just a few months after we've blown it up and started over, we've done so well at connecting people to jobs that SAMHSA has now awarded us a 5th employment specialist. We didn't ask. They said, we love what you're doing. Here's a 5th and a grant. And that grant's part of CORE, right, Van? Kentucky's opioid response effort, where we've knocked down all the silos between government. It's not just justice looking at the corrections population. It's us working with CHFS. It's us working with public health, and Jeff Howard. It's us looking at this with the same lens, with the same effort every day, and looking at these people who are suffering from this disorder to try to get them the treatment they need. But it's not just about treatment. Again, it's about connecting people to all those things that keep them from lapsing back into that disease, helping them battle it. Again, jobs, housing, transportation, and treatment. Mentors. We've flown around the country trying to extract the best ideas from others. But make no mistake, what is Kentucky doing? Kentucky has been a state of first because we've had to be. Again, starting with Governor Fletcher's administration. Again, we've always stepped up to the plate. Think of what Congressman Rogers represents in his effort. I see Karen back there. Kentucky, the first state to have a prescription drug monitoring program, or at least having the gold standard. The first state to follow the CDC's recommendation, and the governor dug his heels in on this, as we did at Justice, to limit prescriptions to 3 days for acute pain, with reasonable exception, by the way. Folks suffering at the end of life, to really restrict the drugs to what they were meant, for what they were meant. We've also, and I know this is controversial, but again, Jeff backed me up on this one in public health. President Trump's appointee, the Surgeon General, Jerome Adams, came to see us just recently, and I had a chance to meet him at the West Wing and the White House not too long ago when he was first appointed. And he couldn't stop talking about Kentucky being the first southern state to take on a syringe support program. I know many of you think, why would we do that? It's enabling, right? Well, the fact of the matter is it does everything you think it doesn't do. It gets people to treatment at 5 times the rate. You walk across the doorstep of one of those and people are in treatment at 5 times the rate. 5 times more likely to enter treatment. It reduces needle sticks to officers by 30% or more, all first responders. It saves Medicaid and tax dollars to the tune of millions I can't even account for, because it battles back the spread of bloodborne illnesses. And in this state, we don't have the luxury of not doing that. Our Hep C rate is 7 times the national average. Doctors, that still hold true? And again, Hilda set the stage for us, those 54 counties. The most vulnerable, one of those things they're most vulnerable to is a rapid outbreak of HIV. Right across the river in Austin, Indiana, where the Surgeon General is from, he talked about the very thing that helped us draw attention to that problem when I was in the legislature. A syringe exchange, a syringe support program helped them battle back rates of HIV that had reached levels well above sub-Saharan Africa. And that's in Austin, Indiana. So we can't allow political ideology or our long-held, convictions, however well-intentioned they may be. We need to find things that work and double down on them, and that's what I think we're doing. And I'll also tell you, for what it's worth, Apple, I'm going to find the CEO, Tim Cook. Every time I do this, it does, the stopwatch doesn't hold up. Shouldn't it automatically tell you and not go back? You were my timekeeper, Tim, and I'm now 22 seconds over. I'm holding you personally responsible for that. Let me take the next 30 seconds to end, and I would have been on time had my phone not gone dark. Let me say this, Hilda, so I can maintain my promise. I will promise you, and there are several other things I'd love to talk about, and maybe I'll get the chance, but I want to promise you something, and I've committed to this. This administration, along with everyone in this room, is working every day. This is the priority in our state for us. It impacts everything we do, from our prison cells to our reentry division, to our SAP division, to things we do in juvenile justice, to the state police, to things we do in drug policy every single day. Criminal justice training has been transformed because of this problem. And I think working together, we can battle it back. So I look forward to a great day of conversation and innovation. Thank you.
I knew you would do a fabulous job. Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary, for that. Absolutely. And I'm always trying to motivate my staff. We want Kentucky to be number one. We want to have more water and sewer applications than anybody else. We want to have more distance learning applications than anyone else. We want to have more rural business, more housing, more whatever. The thing we don't want to have, Mr. Secretary, is we don't want to be number one in the children who have a parent that's incarcerated. That is a devastating. So we now have to start fighting this crisis in full swing. And to lead us, there is not a better person in all of America than our very own, my boss, our Assistant Secretary for USDA's Rural Development. Anne Hazlett comes from our neighboring state of Indiana. She knows this issue from sort of a personal level. She's also not just doing this because the president asked her to and the secretary asked her to. She's doing this because she had already been spending time in her church Celebrate Recovery program as a volunteer. I want to tell you that while I could give you her resume, and she has 3 degrees, she's a lawyer, she has a master's in ag, she's worked on the Hill, she worked in Governor Mitch Daniels' office. I could tell you all of that. But what I really want you to know about Anne Hazlett is that this fight on the opioid crisis is as deep in her heart as anything that I know. And so I feel extremely honored and privileged to work with this lady. Please give a good Kentucky welcome to our Assistant Secretary, Anne Hazlett. Welcome to Kentucky.
Good afternoon, everyone. Okay. So as Hilda noted, I serve as the Assistant to the Secretary of Agriculture for Rural Development, and in that role, I oversee all of our rural development programs at the department. For those of you that we haven't had an opportunity to work with yet, this really includes programs for housing and community facilities, things like hospitals, treatment clinics, recovery housing. We also have utilities programs, so water, electric, importantly, telecommunications, and then rural businesses. And I think, as Secretary Tilley noted from a conversation this morning with his wife, you might...
That's not what we noted.
Boy, your wife really had something to say to you, Mr. Secretary.
I'm not going to say that hadn't happened before.
Obviously, technical difficulties.
But I think the question that he raises is a good one. What is the Department of Agriculture's interest in this issue? And at USDA, our core mission under the leadership of our secretary is really one of building prosperity in rural communities. So as we focus on quality of life and economic opportunity in rural America, this is a high priority for our leadership. Really for two reasons. I think first, while no corner of our country has gone untouched by this issue, the impact on rural communities is tremendous. There was a survey that was conducted last fall by two leading farm organizations, the American Farm Bureau and the National Farmers Union, and their survey found that almost 50% of rural adults have been directly impacted by opioid abuse. And in addition to that, if you take those numbers and you look just at farmers, that number goes up to almost 74% of farmers. So as we look at building prosperity in rural communities, we cannot address that we cannot build strong rural places without tackling this issue. Secondly, as we really look at the needs of rural communities in addressing this issue, there are some unique challenges in rural America, as many of you know from living and working in these places, whether it's lack of treatment services, lack of broadband infrastructure, or sheer isolation. Yesterday, we had a great opportunity to spend the day in Jackson and Clay counties in towns like McKee and Manchester, Kentucky, and I was able to be reminded firsthand of the need for infrastructure in some of these communities. We think that USDA is well positioned to really meet these needs. First, those immediate needs of resources to assist communities in addressing that immediate response, whether it's in the area of prevention, treatment, or recovery. But in addition to that immediate response, we have resources that are really designed to help communities address many of those deeper and more systemic issues that can make these places vulnerable to this crisis in the first place. To deliver those resources, we have staff in all 50 states, many of whom are here today. Our staff, in many cases, have grown up in these places, and they know the impact of this issue firsthand in their towns. They are passionate and they are committed to making a difference on this issue. In fact, today we are joined not only by Hilda here in Kentucky, but several of Hilda's colleagues are here from the state of Arkansas, from Tennessee, and from Maine. Because no two rural communities are the same, we really believe that the most effective solution to this issue lies at that local level. So we see our role at USDA is to come alongside and be a partner to local leaders like many of you in this room in building these solutions. And so to do that, we are engaged on this really in a number of fronts. First, I want to point out that we have a number of program resources that can be used to help communities with prevention, treatment, and recovery. We are blessed that Congress increased our funding to make these critical investments in this fiscal year, and we're wasting no time really in putting those resources to work. During this fiscal year, we are giving priority in a distance learning and telemedicine program we have for projects that address the opioid epidemic in rural America. This program provides grant assistance to communities that want to build that remote connection that will help them access critical health services. In addition to telemedicine, we have around $5 million in grant funding that we have set aside through our community facilities program, and this is designed really to help communities with an investment, whether it's in equipment or in infrastructure. The deadline for these two investments is coming quickly. It's coming on June 4th. And so we would love your help. Maybe you represent a community that could use some of those resources. Would love for you to work with our staff to see if that might be a fit for you. Or if you represent an organization, we would love your help in spreading the word. Information about these funding opportunities can be found on an opioids webpage that we've created. And there should have been a postcard in most folks' chairs that can help tape you to that link. I think it's important to note that beyond those two specific program opportunities that I'm selfishly highlighting today, we have programs for prevention education as well as broader healthcare and public safety infrastructure. And again, those are delivered through our state directors, so please see Hilda or a member of our staff to visit about those resources. In addition, again, to help communities connect to these resources, we have launched an opioids webpage on the USDA website, and there local leaders can find information not only about those program investments that I mentioned, as well as some news updates, importantly, links to several of our federal agency partners, as well as state and local organizations that are also working in this space. We're also featuring some models that we have seen to be particularly effective on the ground. If you have an organization that is working in rural, we would love to include your link on this page as well as a way of helping more people connect to what you're doing. And then lastly, besides the program investments and the webpage, we are really focused on building strategic partnerships and facilitating the adoption of models that we know are working well on the ground. And that's the purpose of these roundtables. Again, as Hilda mentioned, we're going to be holding 5 of these around the country. We began this in March. There was an event that kicked us off in Pennsylvania. We have since been to Nevada, Utah, and Missouri, and we will be going to Oklahoma and Maine. The best practices that we glean from these conversations, we believe, can not only help inform the initiatives that we are developing, but it can also be a resource to other local leaders that are working in this area. So with that, I would like to go ahead and kick off our discussion as we are here today really to learn from each of you to help how we can best shape our own resources to be a better partner to you. To maximize our time, I'm really going to focus our questions, our discussion in 3 buckets, prevention, treatment, and recovery. We can start with prevention. Before we step into that conversation about prevention, I would like to call on Alex Ellswick, who's been in recovery for quite some time now, to really help us set the stage with a bit of your own story. So Alex, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm really honored and thank you. I'm honored and grateful to have the opportunity to be here and to contribute to the solution and contribute to the discussion. And I want to share some of my experience with 3 ends in mind. And the first is to humanize our discussion a little bit. I've spent most of the last year learning how to run regression analysis in a PhD program, and so I know what it's like to spend so much time in front of an Excel spreadsheet that you sort of lose touch with the reality of the problem that you're trying to solve. And I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that we're talking about people who are really suffering and families who are really hurting. And secondly, always to reduce stigma. Research tells us that one of the most effective ways to reduce the stigma associated with substance use disorders is to do exactly what we're doing here, to give a person in recovery the opportunity to stand up and recover out loud. So I'm grateful for that. And then lastly, just to share some lessons that we've gleaned from our experience, both in my addiction and recovery and also in organizing and running our nonprofit organization, Voices of Hope. And some of those is just spreading the message that there's hope in recovery, but it's also some lessons that have some more practical applications as well. So I was born and raised about 45 minutes from here in Lexington, Kentucky, to a really happy, healthy home. No neglect, no abuse. My parents didn't divorce. They didn't use drugs. They drank alcohol very infrequently. But that sort of ideal upbringing couldn't change 2 really important facts about who I was from the day that I was born. And the first is that I was born with the genetic predisposition for addiction. There's just an immense amount of addiction in my extended family. And that meant that from the day that I was born, before I ever made a decision that disappointed my parents, I was more likely than the average person to have a problem with substances. And secondly, from the time that I was young, I've struggled with anxiety. And I've been diagnosed with a number of different anxiety disorders throughout my lifetime. I'm grateful to say I don't struggle with the symptoms of anxiety much today, due in large part to the fact that many of the things that I do to treat and manage my substance use disorder also help me to manage the symptoms of my anxiety. But I think that explains pretty well why, when I was 15 years old, my first experience with marijuana was so different than the experience of so many of my peers. Because the first time that I smoked marijuana is the first time in my entire life that my anxiety dissipated and that I felt normal. And so I firmly believe I developed this chemical relationship with drugs and alcohol right there in that moment. And then at 18 years old, I had elective oral surgery to have my wisdom teeth removed, and I was prescribed oxycodone. And despite the fact that I took it exactly as it was prescribed by my doctor and didn't abuse it, it didn't matter, because for someone with the genetic predisposition and clinical anxiety and a past history of substance use, I could check all the boxes for high risk of developing a substance use disorder. And it's a strange phenomenon to describe the process of becoming addicted, because certainly it's a gradual process at first. I spent about 2 years gradually descending into my addiction. And then in the fall of 2012, I was in my dorm room at Center College studying for the LSAT because I wanted to go to law school. And 9 months from that time, I went through 4 treatment centers, and I ended up spending the last week of my addiction homeless in Dayton, Ohio, sleeping under a bridge under the Highway 35 overpass, shooting heroin and holding a cardboard sign that said homeless and hungry, and taking people's money and putting it in my arms. Just a living, breathing stereotype of all the most awful images that your mind can conjure when you think of drug addiction. That was me, and that's my story. And I don't want the focus, I don't want us to sit in the problem. I don't want to spend any more time talking about the problem because we wouldn't be here if we weren't all well aware that what we have is a problem. But I understand that I'm going to have the opportunity to split my time and talk about recovery a little bit more at the end. So I'll just finish here by saying that by the grace of God and with the help of a lot of people, some of whom are in this room, I've been in recovery since September 13th of 2013. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Alex, for your courage and your willingness to share and really help set the stage. So with that, I'd like to turn to some thoughts on prevention. I think we need to know both the root causes of opioid misuse in our rural communities, but we also need to know what's been effective in helping keep people from beginning to misuse in the first place. Dr. Withrow, I'd like to start with you and just to get your thoughts about what you think some of the driving forces of the opioid epidemic have been here, and what are some of the opportunities that you see for action as we think about those drivers?
I think in order to do that, I'd like to talk about, can you hear me okay?
No, not really. Keep talking, he says.
Okay. I'm glad I'm not the only token Western Kentuckian here. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Right. We speak a little slower.
That's right. I'm instructed to speak very quickly.
That's right.
Anyway, what I would like to do is describe some of the programs that we're involved in Western Kentucky, among which is prevention and also some treatment. But to let you know, at the end of this, to sort of touch on some root causes. Basically, about 3 years ago, I was asked to come out to McCracken County High School and talk to some students who were caught smoking marijuana in the parking lot, along with a 25-year-old recovering heroin addict and a police officer. We did that, and it seemed to work. So what we decided to do was develop a program to go to middle schools. We did that, and we have spoken to about 10,000 kids in 9 counties so far. I take a human brain with me, and I talk about adolescent brain and substance abuse and how that their brain does not mature until they're 25 years old. And whether they know it or not, they are living and playing cards with a half a deck of cards. They don't really know what they're doing. So have some time and understand what they're getting involved with. I ran upon Dr. Hatim Omar, adolescent medicine chief at University of Kentucky. I think some of you in Appalachia know him very well, I think. He was called to Lincoln County and Harrison County when they had a rash of teen suicide, drug, pregnancy, teen pregnancy, school dropouts, and we've had school shootings down in Western Kentucky. He hadn't had any of that. So basically what he did was he came down here to help at their request, and he initiated the Perkins Adolescent Risk Survey. Now that happens, they ask questions, 18 questions of these kids once a year, 6th through 8th grade, and they ask them all sorts of questions about sexual, sleep habits, on and on and on. Important things for middle schoolers to really answer and to know if they're healthy or not with their habits. What they found out was just a caring adult asking those questions, listening to those kids, all of these things got better. No intervention. So a caring adult who will listen to these kids made quite the difference. That impressed me. That impressed me quite a bit. So down in Western Kentucky, we've initiated in-school clinics. We have 9 in-school clinics in Paducah, McCracken County. We have 5 in the city, 4 in the county. We are losing $20,000 a month, but what we do in these clinics, we provide health care for the students, for the teachers, for the families, for the kids of some of these siblings, and we also have mental health counselors there. And we are about to initiate the Perkins test come fall as a pilot program. I've worked with the school superintendents, and basically we started positive action curricula, which is an evidence-based curricula, which it's already started in kindergarten through grade school and middle school, and as a pilot program we plan to start life skills next fall. That is the best evidence-based curriculum ever. It's been going for 30 years, and this is agreed to by our school system down there. And I'm very proud that this is going to make a difference. The sooner we start with prevention, the better off we're going to be. I'm talking kindergarten or before. My daughter is a second grade teacher, and she swears by this thing. She says she can see the positivity in these kids. It's such a positive program. So anyway, I'll move along. We also work with the Angel Initiative, thanks to Commissioner Sanders and Van. They were down here working on that, and actually we have had 6 patients come in already in far western Kentucky, I think 20 across the state, as far as the Angel Initiative that we have gotten into treatment rather than jail. So what are we trying and we're struggling at? We need more rehabilitation beds to get these patients, instead of going to jail, to treatment. And hopefully we'll work with Van on some possible grants for such a thing. And then we need money for the curricula. I'm working with the schools, and that's one of the things that these are proprietary curricula. They are expensive, but they are worth it. If we can start, I practiced interventional cardiology for years and years and years, and I can tell you, I'd rather prevent it than have to treat it. It's so expensive, and they don't do as well if you prevent it rather than treat it. So there are other opportunities involved with these school clinics. School clinic is a great resource for both mental and physical health. Federally qualified health centers. We're right now negotiating with a federally qualified health center. They have a whole different set of rules that they can play by, and they can be sustainable, whereas if it's a hospital, Baptist Health Paducah, that is not sustainable. We can't continue to do this. We're not going to quit till we can find something else, hopefully, that we can do. One of the other things about the Perkins test is we can get volunteers, retired teachers, social workers, people in the community, empty nesters. They can come in there and they can talk to these kids, because a lot of these kids have no one. They have no one. So what do we find are the root causes for the opioid epidemic? Well, down our way, it's methamphetamine epidemic and some opioid pills, but it's tobacco, alcohol, and marijuana. So lack of at least one trusted adult in that child's life. So we encourage parents or some friend or some family member somehow to take an interest and talk to these kids. They need a safe place for the child to talk to an adult who cares and who's sympathetic. And these kids need something useful to do with their extra time. If they go home and both parents or one parent's working, they're going to get in trouble. We need after-school programs. Back in 95 through 99, there were 5,000 after-school programs back then, and we stopped them because of no money. But, a lot of things have happened since then, but the problems were unheard of back then. Availability of the drug. We got the medicine cabinet where drugs are there. Peers bring them to school. Doctors overprescribing. We can work on all these things. Another thing is extremely important, age of first use of tobacco, alcohol, and marijuana. We stress that to these kids. The age of first use, the younger they are, the more likely they're going to be addicted to probably multiple drugs. And as was pointed out, genetics. There's something, the kids need to know it. They need to understand that, again, with their half a deck, they need to understand that genetics is important. Growing permissiveness and acceptance of marijuana use, including parents. Now, how do you talk to kids, don't use marijuana, when the kids' parents are smoking dope? What kind of message is this going to be? They say, well, 29 states it's legal, or in D.C. it's legal. It's a medicine, doc. Go operate on somebody. What are you doing talking to us about this? They're kids. They have arrested but maturation looking down the barrel of right now. And let's see, kids think, I've talked to, I don't know how many 6th through 8th graders, kids think it's not a danger, it's not a problem to me. And I've already talked about doctors overprescribing. Okay, the key challenges, we need to encourage and facilitate interaction with parents and a caring adult. We've talked about after-school programs already. Education to encourage sober living with a consistent and persistent message. We need to do this over and over because it takes repetition to these kids. there are other opportunities will be available. Hopefully, if we can get some grants, we can expand these in-school programs. I'm a firm believer. A lot of kids don't have any medical care if it wasn't for these in-school programs. And like I say, this is patterned after what Hatim Omar has done in Appalachia, in Lincoln County, and in Harrison County. See, because of limited talent and resources in the country, you know, a lot of times we have to wear more than one hat. The geography of where the facilities are and where the patients are, that's also a problem and can be a barrier. Now, there are other root causes. I wrote an editorial opinion that I put over there on the table. If you would take that and read it, it covers a lot of things. I don't have time to talk about all this stuff, but thank you very much.
No, thank you, Dr. Withrow, very much. I'm actually going to turn to Secretary Tilley to expand on that question. And the reason I'm going to turn to you so quickly, sir, is I, too, was greatly impacted by the book Dreamland. And I think that it really lays out a lot of what's happening in different parts of our country that has made these places more vulnerable. So I'd love your perspective on what you've seen in Kentucky.
Sure. And I appreciate the accommodation. I apologize for having to cut out a little bit early, so she's coming back to me quickly. Let me say this. I think one thing, the importance of USDA, I failed to mention this, many things in my allotted time, but rural jail populations are actually the only ones on the rise. Urban jail populations are on the decrease, which is indicative of this problem, and I think it also underscores how important it is for the USDA to be involved. So that, again, is a key thing. Why did it hit Kentucky hardest, or several states around us? I think that's a multifaceted answer, a lot to unpack. I think you can start with the relentless marketing of pain pills, which is detailed quite extensively in the book Dreamland. I think, again, if you've read it, you understand. If not, I can promise you that it was intentional, and it was incredibly pervasive. And it stuck in places like northeast Kentucky and southern Ohio first and branched out from there, and the model was born. I think, why did they choose that area? Why was it so prevalent there? I think one can look at our rates of behavioral health disorders in this state are higher than most. I think folks are self-medicating conditions which go untreated. In the late 60s, when the Community Mental Health Center Act the Community Mental Health Act was passed, we deinstitutionalized folks. That was the right thing to do, but the promise was that we would ramp up mental health treatment in the communities, which did not happen. And so folks turned to self-medicating anything in their life, from anxiety to trauma. We see that the women that serve in our jails and prisons have incredibly high rates of trauma. Oftentimes sexual abuse, physical abuse. Kentucky has 650,000 victims of domestic violence alone every year in this state. What does a person do dealing with that trauma? They turn to whatever they can find to self-medicate when the proper resources aren't available. Certainly areas of our state are underserved and suffer from joblessness, and I think that's clearly a factor we're all working toward. Thank goodness that Kentucky had a record year in economic development just last year with $9.2 billion and 17,000 new jobs. That will take a while to filter up and build the kind of healthy infrastructure we need. Overall rates of wellness in this state are improving, but for those years they were down. And I can tell you, I think it was part of the perfect storm. What I failed to tell you, even though the Kentucky is still ninth in per capita rates of incarceration, and we had really climbed out of that top 10 at one time, for the decade, starting in 1999 or 2000 and ending in 2010, our prison growth rate was actually quadruple the national average. So we have slowed that dramatically. But you look at what that had a perpetuating impact on children and trauma. When parents go to prison or jail, what does that leave behind? It leaves behind a mess. So kids that were impacted by that are now kids that are sadly in our residential treatment centers, Tim, and also in intensive outpatient care or under a bridge somewhere suffering like Alex was. And what an incredible story Alex tells. I've heard that for the third time, and I'm impacted more each time I hear your story. So I'll simply say this. Again, I know we have a lot of people to get to, but I think in Kentucky it was the perfect storm. But understand, again, what the governor said to me one time, what happened in northern New Hampshire? It didn't just happen in Kentucky, and now it's not just happening in Missouri and Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and places around us in West Virginia. It's happening in all 50 states at varying rates, and it's again come to be called a pandemic.
Thank you. Thank you, Secretary Tilley. Tom, I'm going to turn to you next, really from the leadership that we have an opportunity to learn from with Representative Rogers and Operation Unite. Can you talk a bit about some of the activities that y'all have in place to address the crisis, particularly in the area of prevention, and can some of those activities be replicated in other communities?
I assume this is not working.
You should have one right beside you, Tom.
There you go. Here we go. Yeah. Well, thank you. It's hard to tell what Unite does without going back to the beginning of it, because it's a very human story and it's one that can be replicated, and if you look at the end result, it's too daunting to think you can ever get there. Congressman Rogers read a story in the newspaper about an addiction, the loss of life, the effects on children, and it hit him in such a way that he said, we've got to do something about that. And he found individuals who had really little knowledge of the problem, but were willing to find out what to do about the problem. And out of that grew Unite, Unlawful Narcotics, Investigation, Treatment, and Education, a three-pronged program. And at that time, it was the first one to ever be address that. It doesn't help, it doesn't hurt to find someone like Miss Karen back here in the back, who started as the first director of Unite, and Nancy Hale, who's carried on that legacy very efficiently. The way to address it in many ways is the community. It started with a large parade after Derby and a rainy day, which we could have had this year almost, in Clay County, Kentucky, where the people said, we're going to take our community back. They met in churches, they met in civic clubs, and they said, we will take our community back from the drug lords that are here. That's the way it starts. And it doesn't start with anything other than the motivation from within to live a good life and have a place for your children and for adults to live. It attacked public corruption. It attacked drug dealers. I spent nearly 30 years as a Commonwealth attorney. I saw the evolution of drugs. I saw the acceptance of pharmaceutical drugs as it's not a crime because doctors give it out. And to where now we see that it is a crime and it destroys a nation. But it takes education within the community, and it's got to come from within the community and not outside. Maybe Eastern Kentucky is different from others, but the pride that's in the citizens there that they like to rely upon their own. So it's got to be self-born. And with that, it takes the community leaders. And each community has to find those, and each community has to have a leader. One of the strongest points of Unite are children. There are clubs in nearly every school, every grade school and middle school and some high schools, where it's addressing children, and children are addressing adults. There are the Camp Unite, over 300. I dare say that anyone in this room, if you haven't cried in 20 years and you come to the closing ceremony of Camp Unite and you see children address others, that at 12 years old they are raising their younger siblings and are happy to do so because they know they have to. Children are the answer. We have to address those. So getting into the schools, getting into the social fabric, like Shoot Hoops, Not Drugs, where we bring down former UK players to always attract a crowd. They come in while the children are taking lessons from this basketball hero. The parents are off with the Unite counselors saying, this is what's got to change. You've got to hook the adults along with the children. There are other Camps Unite, getting into the schools, and the community coalitions, which keep the programs going because it's evolving. You can't keep one person in there for 20 years. But as parents have drugs in their family, as communities become aware of drugs in their community, they also want to participate. So you have to have community coalitions that bring it all about too. So unite unlawful narcotics, investigation, treatment, and education. Law enforcement's got to be involved in it. The medical profession's got to be involved in it. Children are the key to our future, and they cannot be forgotten on the war on drugs. They cannot be forgotten when their parents go to prison, when their parents are abusing them, or when they go to school and get influenced by other children. So that, in my opinion, and I think much of Unite's opinion, let's never forget the children. And as the congressman said then, in fact, he went on to create the summit. And I suppose many of you have been to the drug summit as a national organization. So there's not one person that can say, I can't do it. He had the position of being in Congress, but one person got a movement started in a local, depressed area of Kentucky that became the largest national convention on drug prevention. The largest one, addressed by 2 presidents to come to it. That started with one man, but he didn't do it alone. It depended upon leaders in every community to stand up shoulder to shoulder and say, as they did in Clay County, we're going to take back our community from the drug lords that live here.
Thank you, Tom. David, I'm going to turn to you next. You are currently administering 2 opioid grants. Can you talk about the goal of each initiative? Who are some of the key partners, and what are some of the activities coming out of that grant that you think will make a difference?
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And in many ways, I feel like the least expert person on the panel. I direct the Northeast Kentucky Area Health Education Center. And for those of you who are familiar with AHEC, we traditionally have done health careers pipeline activities, so dealing with middle school, high school, college students, trying to get them to pursue medical careers. But as Secretary Tilley mentioned, this problem is huge, and Northeast Kentucky is one of the areas that it really hit hardest in our state. So we felt obligated to take a look at it and see what we, as a regional AHEC, could do to address it. And we found a niche that we feel like we are providing an important service on, and that's education. That's something that's been mentioned a few times already today. So the Northeast Kentucky AHEC that I direct applied for and received a HRSA primary care training and enhancement grant last year to facilitate a series of educational activities for healthcare providers and health profession students within our region. And one of the rationales for that funding opportunity was an Institute of Medicine report that found that only about half of primary care providers felt somewhat prepared to treat patients with pain. So Dr. Withrow, Governor, being medical practitioners, that was kind of staggering to us that providers didn't have the level of expertise in treating pain that I think we would assume that they have. So we as an AHEC set out to provide education to those healthcare professionals about medication-assisted treatment, other best practices to try to improve the lives of people within our region who are affected by opioid use disorder. So we're a few months into the project at this point, started last July. We've had about a dozen educational activities. We've already exceeded the target number of attendees that we said we would have. We've had large events in Maysville, Ashland, Winchester, Van Egram. You've been to a couple of these. We had an event in Winchester in February. We had almost 100, mostly healthcare practitioners in the audience that night. We've developed a cadre of speakers that are developing expertise within our region that have presented at numerous activities. So we think we're getting a group of professionals that really care about the topic and are willing to share their expertise. Dr. Young, she's been mentioned earlier. She is one of those speakers. When she gets her voice back, she's going to do some more presentations for us. But we've had presentations about the disease of addiction, medication-assisted treatment. Dr. Young's presentation is on needle sharing for heroin use and the dangers that presents for contracting HIV, hepatitis C. And various other topics as well. So we keep thinking that at some point we're going to kind of saturate the market. Our region, we're 17 counties, and we've had, again, numerous activities. And we think at some point providers are going to say, okay, I've heard enough about this, but that hasn't happened yet. Again, a recent one we had 100 people at. Dreamland has been mentioned a few times already. So we are having the Dreamland author, Sam Quinones, from Los Angeles, is coming to Moorhead September 5th. Mark your calendars. We're expecting a large event there. And I think that the continued large attendance is an indication that healthcare providers recognize that, to some extent at least, they had a role in contributing to this epidemic, and that they now are dedicated to learning as much as they can about this and trying to have a role in addressing the epidemic going forward. The other project that kind of grew out of that, so we dealing with the adult population. Dr. Withrow mentioned how rural youths are so at risk. So once we got into the project, we said, we think we're doing some good work, but we know the problem is so big, we need to reach out to other target groups as well. So we applied for a grant from Cardinal Health Foundation to create the PEAKS program, is what we're calling it. So it's prescription education for Appalachian Kentucky students. And we're going to be providing education about prescription misuse and trying to prevent that within 7 counties in our service region. And those counties were selected based on overdose rates and drug arrest rates within those counties. And we also, so those are 7 high schools that we're targeting within those counties, but also in the college students, we're targeting what AHEC traditionally, the health careers pipeline. So students that are pursuing careers as physician, physician assistant, nurse practitioner, whatever the case may be. We found research that indicated that physicians in particular are no more likely than the general public to abuse alcohol or illegal drugs, but that they are more likely to abuse prescription drugs. So we thought, we've got a group of students that are on that pathway. We need to give some focused attention to them. So they are a specific target for this program. That program actually started May 1st, so it's just starting. We're having a conference call tomorrow actually with the funder to talk about really rolling that out. Another aspect of that program, we are required to engage with the trusted adults in those kids' lives, and Dr. Withrow touched on that. I mean, you can't just focus on this on one particular segment. It's got to be across the board. So I'm pleased that Cardinal Health realized that, and they are forcing us, and we're glad to do it, to focus on the students, but also their trusted adults. And an aspect that they are emphasizing that I think is going to really be interesting for us and going to be really productive is that we're using youth-led intervention, is what they're calling it. So in our case, they've got a set criteria of a curriculum of information to share. So we're going to have our medical residents and medical students learn that, train the college students get trained on it, then the college students are going to train the high school students. So I think that kind of hearing it more peer-to-peer is going to be really effective in sharing that information. So that's 2 of the programs that we've got. We're partnering with the school systems, obviously, for that second project. For the supplemental education program, healthcare providers, healthcare facilities across our region, they're inviting us into their medical staff meetings to share this information. So I think everybody realizes what a large problem it is, and they're all, to this point, have been willing to invite us in and share that information.
Thank you, David. Danielle, I want to turn to you about a specific aspect of prevention, but before we do that, Governor Fletcher, can I call on you? I think you wear 2 unique hats in this, both as a public policy leader, but also as a physician yourself. And do you have a perspective on the comments that have been offered about the need for education in this space?
Yeah, Secretary Hazlett, thank you. And the rest of the panel, Secretary Tilla, Hilda, especially thanks to you. As we look, and I've read the book Dreamland and some of the other, obviously, extensive literature, we've done a lot of work in health and well-being. A lot of that is lifestyle, and a lot of it is addiction. Affects the same neurotransmitters as you see the opioids do. So I think we've got to move further upstream, and we're continuing to do that in the prevention. We've got a lot of effort on reducing the prevalence, which is the number of people that actually are affected at any one time, but the incidence we really haven't impacted, and it continues to increase. I think it's a public health crisis, pandemic, whatever you want to call it. And Dr. Withrow, you've done a lot of work on prevention. I still think we have a gap on collecting a lot of data, doing registries, treating it like a disease from an epidemiological standpoint. I spent a year at the CDC, and we've worked with some of those folks, and there's a lot of folks that share this passion. Jeff Howard. So I think as we look at this, we've got to have an umbrella of public health approach to this epidemic, which means that we need to have registries, we need to be contacting people, we need to have the make sure that the personal health information is protected, which we have, I think, Regulation 42 for that. But not only that, but we need to start collecting a lot of data, doing a lot of analytics on it, and finding out what are the contributing factors. Dreamland did something from a research basis, and a lot of folks have gathered a lot of information. We know some of the correlative issues, overprescribing, genetics, Portsmouth, Ohio, where Dreamland started, the loss of jobs and the hopelessness of communities, the lack of purpose in life. And I think until we get to those underlying issues and start addressing those in communities and in people's lives, I don't think we're going to impact the incidence enough. Working with education is extremely important. We started kind of a Get Healthy Kentucky. Glenna, my First Lady, did that. And it was getting at that point when you can start early. And I've never heard of a half deck, but I'm going to use that from now on, especially with my grandkids. And I'm going to stop now, but I just want to emphasize the impact of getting at the incidence of this. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure is an old adage that we've all heard from probably our grandparents. And nothing is more true. If Alex, your story like that, if we'd known, or if you'd known more and had the support in the community, you may have known when that first, puff of marijuana was there that there would be the information out to say, hey, you're susceptible. And then the second thing, if the physicians had realized what they're doing, we're even doing now genetic testing, I will say, for when we treat statins, antidepressants, and other things. We know who's going to respond to them and who's not. And I think we need to be doing the same things when we're looking at opioids. Eventually we'll have some testing and say, this person is very susceptible. We need to either use another alternative method and let them, and I know that the HEAL program, NIH, is working on alternative pain medications. But we've got to be able to discern folks that are at risk. We've got to put communities together and give people hope and purpose in life. And we'll talk a little bit more of that when we talk about Recovery Kentucky. Thanks, Ann.
Thank you, Governor. Danielle, I want to close out the prevention discussion with you and just focus on a challenge that many is across the country, but many rural states in particular, is just the rising number of babies that we see born with neonatal abstinence syndrome, or NAS. Can you talk a bit about your prevention work to try and decrease the number of children that are born drug dependent? How is that being funded? Who are some of your partners? And can this be replicated in other communities?
Okay, sure. So the Big Sandy NAS prevention program was started about 2 years ago, which is actually right around the same time that legislation was passed that required hospitals to report on their NAS births. Previously, we didn't really have to report. We kept our numbers, but they weren't sent to the Department of Public Health. And so over the past few years, our numbers, we've gotten reports, and that helps us a lot. So the number of NAS births have increased rapidly over the past 10 to 15 years. So in the year 2000, we had around 30 births in the state of Kentucky that were drug dependent. And in 2016, that was around 1,200. And so almost a 5,000% increase over the past 15 years. It's really prevalent, and no one really knows about it, which is a huge issue. I certainly didn't before I started working in healthcare. And if you're in the audience and you knew that was a problem, please raise your hand. So maybe one person. And so we had a huge issue with education, and we had a huge issue with our mothers really not having any kind of prevention programs whatsoever. And so we decided to create our Big Sandy NAS prevention program, which is really a coalition of numerous different partners that I'll talk to you about in just a minute. But when we decided to create that program, we wanted to focus on at-risk pregnant mothers and ask them what really they wanted out of a program and what would work. So we decided to go and have focus groups, and we visited Community of Hope and Serenity House in our communities. We spoke to women that had had NAS births before, some that were using and pregnant at that time. And so we really got some good insight of what would work for a program. And then we also held a community forum. We asked anybody at all that wanted to come and had any interest in NAS at all, and they attended that forum. It was back in March of last year. And those also, we held a call to action in that forum. And so we asked anybody in our community that wanted to come and help and what programs they had or if they have referral sources. And then the people that attended that forum really helped us to develop our coalition. So a few of the things that we have done over the past couple years, we have applied for and received a few grants. Actually, some of those were from UNITE, so thank you. And with that grant money, we bought presentation materials. We have an animatronic baby that we take around to area school systems, and it's really impactful because it shakes and it's a recorded cry of an actual NAS baby. And if you don't know, NAS babies exhibit pretty much the same symptoms as an adult. And so they have often diarrhea, inconsolable cries. They sometimes shake so hard that they appear to levitate off of the table. And so it's a really great welcome to the world for NAS infants. And no one, again, really knew that that was an issue until the last couple years. And so we applied for and received those grants. We take our baby and presentations into our area school systems. We have educated right around 800 students so far over the past couple years in our area high schools and middle schools. And then we also found a need in our community for our providers to be educated, because the people that were serving these infants, well, first of all, these infants that are born drug dependent have a totally different set of needs than a regular healthy newborn. And so we needed our providers at the hospital and throughout the rest of the community to be educated on how to take care of those infants. And so we contacted our coalition, contacted the Kentucky Perinatal Association, as well as the Department of Public Health. And we brought them to Prestonsburg, Kentucky for a conference, a day-long conference. We invited nurses, we invited our providers, pediatricians, but also anybody else in the community that sees not just NAS babies while they're in the hospital or directly after, but in the school systems or in Head Start. So we had Head Start directors, we had our Early Childhood Coalition. That event was attended by about 150 people back in October of last year. And so a day-long conference, and we taught about safe sleep, which is also a huge issue in Kentucky and in the Big Sandy area. Our NAS births are 3 times the rate of Kentucky, where my hospital is located, but also our SUDS death, or sudden unexpected deaths, is 2 times the state rate. So we have a desperate need for education, not just about NAS, but about afterbirth and how to care for your children. So that was a really, really good conference, and we welcome anybody that wants to talk to us about that, because it was really easy to set up with Kentucky Perinatal Association. And then we also have showcased our efforts at the SOAR Summit, which is in Pikeville. It's a really great event for shaping our Appalachian region, also Hal Rogers. And then we also have spoken at their provider education events. And then we are working with the Department of Public Health to create a new program. And that'll be in our health departments, and we want it to be sort of a one-stop shop. And Dr. Bada from DPH actually brought this to our coalition and spoke to us about it, and we think it's going to be phenomenal. Hopefully, women that come into our health departments for other reasons, whether it be for WIC or for their clinic visits, they'll be able to have a one-stop shop so they can have their counseling while they're there. They can also have treatment, hopefully. They can have parenting classes while they're there. They'll have NAS education, peer support, just a plethora of things that's available for these women when they just visit their regular health department, which is something we do not have anywhere at the moment or anywhere close to us. And so hopefully that program, they're coming to our coalition meeting in June, and we hope to have that program started up by the end of the year this year. And DPH, thankfully, is researching some funding for us to have that, because we do not have funding. As far as our partners go, we have a ton of people from, of course, the healthcare realm. So we have our nurses, our OB directors, not just from our hospital, but from others as well. And we have providers as far as pediatricians or family practice. But then we also have community advocates. We have people from early childhood on our coalition. We have our Head Start directors. We have treatment centers. Really, anybody that wants to be active and do something at all about NAS, we have them on our coalition. So that's about 40 or 50 people every quarter that show up to our meetings. And so we've really done a lot over the past couple years, and we have quite a few of our community partners that are really willing to help, especially after you go out and tell them all the symptoms and tell them how prevalent the issue is. In our own hospital, every month, about 100 kids are born with NAS in Kentucky, and for our hospital, that's about 20%. So it's a big issue.
Thank you, Danielle.
You're welcome.
I'd like to move on to treatment. I think when we look at this issue, access to treatment is critical in any community, but particularly in rural areas. There is some data that suggests that more than 80% of people living in a rural area living in a county that does not have any form of treatment services. And so with that reality in rural communities in many places, jail often becomes default treatment, and that is not effective or sustainable. So I want to start with Director Elmers, and your agency recently made $485 million available in funding to states to do a number of things, increasing access to treatment being one of them. Can you talk a bit about that funding, how rural communities can access it, and what you hope it could do in a state like Kentucky?
Thank you so much. And yes, I mean, just from the beginning, I will just say that this is a number one priority for Secretary Azar, as it is for our administration and President Trump. He has heard the stories. He knows how devastating it is for our families. And he also understands that it is so widespread, especially in our rural communities. I know, Hilda, you had cited the statistics that had come out, the report that basically highlighted the 220 rural counties throughout the country. The bad news about that, if it wasn't bad enough, is that that's just the top 5%. And the majority of them are in Kentucky. And for Region 4, which are the 8 southeast states, basically almost just under 50% of the counties that are highlighted are within Region 4. So you can see what a devastating situation this is. The good news is that we're addressing it. And the federal funding has come available, especially for our rural communities. And, there are basically at this point in a couple of buckets, HRSA, which we've already discussed, has funding availability, but SAMHSA as well, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Through that, it is made available to the states in STRs, or state treatment responses, state targeted responses to the opioid crisis. And each state is developing that plan, and each governor's office is in direct contact with SAMHSA in that effort. The funds then become available to the counties, to the communities through that effort. And the focus is on prevention, treatment, and recovery. When we're talking about treatment, we're talking about a wide variety. One of the things that I would say if someone is looking for a treatment center, the website that HHS has, hhs.gov/opioids. There's actually a treatment locator there that you can put in your area. For instance, we looked it up in Atlanta. That's where I'm based out of Atlanta. And we came up with 112 different treatment centers within a 30-mile radius. Now, that isn't necessarily telling you what type of treatment it is, but that does give families a starting point. And that's what we really understand is the issue. I also want to talk about one of the other initiatives that we have available through HHS that many of you may not be aware of, in that we have got to engage the faith community on this issue. And one of the centers we have in HHS through IEA, or Intergovernmental and External Affairs, is actually our Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnership Center. It is headed by Shannon Royce. She is basically the director of these programs, and they actually have a toolkit that they have available online and, for use for any faith communities that are looking at really reaching out and whether it's starting a recovery group or just making available funding for these things. We know the answers are within the communities. We know that. One of the other things that we have done in Atlanta, collaboration is key as well. When we're talking about federal dollars, when we're talking about working together, we've all got to work together, just as USDA has come forward on this issue because it's affecting all of our rural communities. So is that what we have seen in Atlanta. We've formed our regional opioid crisis coalition, where all of our the agencies at the federal level and the different operational divisions of HHS come together on a regular basis to talk about this issue, be able to understand what is available through each different operational division and what is happening, whether it's talking about reentry into communities with housing, with our HUD counterparts, or whether we're talking about making sure that FQHCs are receiving the funding through HRSA. There's just so much that needs to be done. There is a lot that is happening. But again, I stress, it has to be at the community level. The federal dollars trickle down to the community, and they have to be utilized. And one of the things that is key to this is it's based on accountability. The states have got to be accountable for the dollars that are being spent. There has to be a result. And I think you're seeing it, but it is definitely of key importance. And I'll just finish by saying I also believe that the key is with our children. And obviously, I have the benefit in Atlanta of working with the CDC and working with those issues where they're investigating all of these things right now, and the research is being done. We know that that's the key, and I just thank you for all you are doing on that issue as well.
Thank you, Renee. I want to turn things over to Secretary Tilley to give a perspective on what some of this money might mean in Kentucky. But before I do that, I appreciate you raising the faith-based community. And we actually have Mike Beatty. Where is Mike? In our crowd. Back here in the back, USDA has a counterpart to the woman that Renee mentioned. And for us, that's Mike Beatty. He joins us today and is very eager to work with the faith-based partners in rural Kentucky and many other states. So thank you, Mike, for being here and for your leadership. With that, I will let Secretary Tilley give a local perspective.
Sure. Quickly, just Danielle, where you left off, I think it's important. What a great primer you gave on how important it is. We began talking in the legislature years ago about this incredible prevalence of NAS, addicted babies, and what that means to just the incredible element of human suffering. To eliminate that is enough of a priority. But beyond that, the return on investment is somewhere around 10 to 1. So while we say dollars are scarce, we can't afford not to invest in eliminating that incredibly cruel condition. And so we've done that. We actually have funding at the state level. I know you're working with public health to do that, but Van can tell you exactly how much we have. It varies, but we've given out every dollar. We have a record amount of state investment this year coming to us. So to your question, Secretary, we're going to meet, Van is in a couple of weeks, the administration, sort of a couple-day retreat on exactly how to do this, because we can't afford to waste $1. We have to find what works. We have to, if we fail, let's fail fast. Let's move those programs out. Let's move on to what does. So what we found does work is investment in NAS. We've found that community mental health centers, obviously investment in them and intensive outpatient treatment can be just as effective depending on the person suffering as a residential treatment, which can be very effective in a place like Tim's element. So corrections, we're doubling down on that. We have, by some estimates, up to 18,000 people in prison who need intensive treatment today. We can't possibly provide every one of those individuals the treatment they need, but we are getting there. But see, the added element that is a problem in Kentucky is that we house half of our state inmate population in county jails. Only one other state in the country does that. It's not a model I would recommend to anyone. There's 76 full-service jails in Kentucky. Only 21 offer any form of treatment. So that's how, again, vast this problem is to us. So thank you for the money, because that will help dramatically. Law enforcement has to be a part of it. Tom and I spent several months together, maybe a couple of years of our lives together on a task force that resulted in some important reforms. One of the things we talked about was getting things through the court system fast, getting people to treatment, so rocket dockets is being funded. Law enforcement-assisted diversionary efforts are being funded, providing first responders, including law enforcement, with Narcan or naloxone to reverse an overdose and save lives. Listen, we have a campaign in Kentucky started by the governor called Don't Let Them Die, and it grew out of a program, or grew out of a phrase we heard oftentimes, which should never come out of anyone's mouth, but why don't you just let them die? As I sit here and look to my left at Alex, you all take a good look at this young man. How could any human being let that come out of their mouth? And they were talking about that individual under a bridge, like you were, and I look at him today. So we're not going to let them die. Again, more residential treatment. Even our medical examiner's office, we announced just last week partnering with UK and U of L. Both universities have a lot to offer. UK has a nationally respected Center for Alcohol and Drug Research. So we're trying to move our forensic pathologists to let us learn more about what drugs are impacting our people. We had a record number of deaths. Those autopsies, sadly, are a reality and are important. And they're also important in prosecution, Tom, to prosecute those dealers who are bringing the poison into our country. Harm reduction model. And now lastly, I'll say, through KYASAP, we're driving money down to the local level, which is so important because the problems are different. They're vastly different in West Kentucky than they are East Kentucky, as the doctor explained. So we need to give our local communities some money to use as they see fit, whether it be in prevention or treatment on the back end, or for that matter, Tom, interdiction with law enforcement in the middle.
Judge Mosley, I want to turn to you next. I think as we look at the need for treatment in rural areas, certainly innovation is something that has to be addressed, whether it's how we deliver it or how we help people access. Understand that you have taken a hard look at transportation in Harlan County, have recognized that as a real challenge to assisting people who want to get help. Can you talk a bit about your Rides for Recovery initiative? How is that funded? What success have you seen? And how could we replicate that in other places?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Appreciate you coming to spend time with us to learn more about what we're doing to combat this major problem here. Thanks to Governor Fletcher, back several years ago, we were able to open our first treatment center in Harlan County 10 years ago, I guess that was now. I remember that groundbreaking. And then Tim Robinson also put a facility in. Now we have 2 female treatment centers, but we do not have a men's treatment center. And the closest one is about an hour and 45-minute to 2-hour drive for our people. So those that may have a ride to get there, maybe somebody's not willing to take them, and some have had no option to be able to get because they don't have a vehicle. But they're ready to go either on their own free will or they're ready to go as a result of a court order mandating treatment. And so we implemented about a year and a half ago through a grant from Unite Coalition, Rides for Recovery program, in partnership with our public transportation, Harlan County CAA, as well as another entity known as Bluegrass Transit, to give people an opportunity to be transported directly to a treatment center if a bed wasn't available in our county for females, out to another county, or for males who had no access to it locally. The Unite Coalition grant was a small grant. It ran out of funding, and we line item some money through just program support through our county general government dollars to further that program. And we have enough funding right now to get through this fiscal year, and in our new budget, I've appropriated an amount to get us through another fiscal year. Because I took some heat for it, because some people don't understand why that's important. But like I explained it to a gentleman the other day that asked me about it, I said, do you know how much you spend of your tax dollars to keep someone in a jail? Providing them a ride to a treatment program to change their life to keep them from going back into the jail is much more of an investment than feeding them in the jail. So
exactly how much.
You know, and yeah, exactly. It resonated very well, and he said, I never thought of it that way. And that's the thing. We look at it as an investment as opposed to a cost, and it's worked really well. We've had we're still measuring our success because we've just been doing it about a year and a half. But the public transportation partner has been ready anytime we've needed them. We've partnered with our local drug court to make this work. It absolutely is something that can be replicated everywhere, not just in our county. We feel like that the access is the biggest issue. I think the statistic is, I think 14% trying to get into treatment can actually get a bed. And we recently just submitted an application the other day to partner with a neighboring county to try to rehab a building to have a men's treatment center near our borders. It's not in my county, but that don't matter. It needs to. It's still close enough to where my people could access it. So we feel like that the access, no one should be denied a bed in treatment because they can't get there. We shouldn't be telling people, no, you can't go because you don't have a way there. And we feel like we've corrected that in our county, and are excited to see the results of that expand everywhere else.
Thank you, Judge Mosley, and I appreciate you raising the dollars and cents reality of this. We had an opportunity to visit this morning with Judge Taylor in Madison County, and he presented some very sobering statistics in that regard as well, and looking at really how we innovate and be pioneers in creating a structure that creates a long-term solution in these families. I want to turn next to you, Judge Tapp, to help us have a perspective on one of the great successes that we have seen around the country, which is the use of drug courts. You've been recognized both here in Kentucky and nationally for being a pioneer in this area. Wondered if you can tell us a bit about the Addiction Recovery Care Project and what you have seen come from that.
Absolutely.
I've got to go. Can I brag on one of the things he had? I want to brag on the SMART court. If you don't get a chance, drug courts are one thing, SMART court's another. The national model for that, we actually took an idea from another state. A former U.S. attorney was running a program called the HOPE model. We call it SMART in Kentucky. He runs one of, if not the best in the country, and we've got to have more. We only have 7 pilot, and we're going to try to do. We had a discussion to try to expand that. I hate to interrupt, but I've got to go, and I wanted folks to know that their innovation in Kentucky it's acute here, but I think we're generally seen as being as forward-thinking as any state in the country on this matter, and we've got the best policy, and it's because of all the things you've heard today and the kind of thing you'll hear about in a minute. But listen, I apologize for running, and thanks, Hilda, for letting me be here.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
I don't think we should give him applause because he's leaving, but he's a great leader.
You know, one of the problems with going last is you hear so many things you want to make a quick comment about. We have a new women's treatment facility being opened in Somerset through Recovery Kentucky over a decade after we first tried to get one, so huge debt of gratitude to Recovery Kentucky. You know, as I said here, you'll have to forgive my doodle, but I heard about enforcement in the middle. I heard about prevention at the beginning. I heard about treatment at the end. And, of course, I drew the circle because this is all really about a continuum of care. And I was reminded throughout this discussion here of a conversation I had with a young woman today in drug court at 8 o'clock this morning who was interested in pursuing treatment. And the discussion basically involved this. How many crimes do you believe you've been involved with in your life? And she started out, of course, well, this is the first time I've ever caught a serious charge, a possession. Big deal, frankly, in the schemes of what we deal with. But as I engaged her in the discussion, she eventually said, when we talked about the 13 years she'd been an addict, she talked about thousands and thousands of crimes. You want to reduce the impact on law enforcement, provide treatment. You want to help with preventing future problems with NAS babies or with our children and everything else, provide treatment to the parents and everything. It's all a circle, and that's why we're so excited about what we've been able to do here in South Central rural Kentucky. We started a program, a medication-assisted treatment program, the first one in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and I was so happy to hear, Madam Secretary, you talk about the unique challenges that rural America faces and how we need to be flexible in those approaches, because that's absolutely correct. Things that work for us in rural Kentucky may not be well replicated in Cincinnati or Louisville or Paducah, perhaps, but there are things that work real well for us. And in terms of medication-assisted treatment, for us, it's been the use of naltrexone. I have people on all forms of medication-assisted treatment, and there are 3 approved by the FDA. We know them all, of course, methadone, buprenorphine, and then naltrexone. Naltrexone is the only one which is not an opioid, or at least a partial opioid. The other 2 forms of treatment are associated with abuse and with diversion, posing a tremendous problem for law enforcement. They pose tremendous problems for me in a court setting because they're commonly abused, commonly traded in the court. So for us, it's been naltrexone, Vivitrol, if you will. And we have been able to partner such that we can offer naltrexone essentially to someone in any stage of the proceedings. When they come in pre-trial, before they've pled guilty or before they've been convicted, on regular probation, on smart probation, as the Secretary mentioned, or in drug court. And out of that initial effort has grown, I believe, by leaps and bounds, not only here in Kentucky, but to other states. It has been so successful. Today we crossed the threshold century mark. 101 people as of today is what I was informed we've had on naltrexone. And the vast majority, well above 80% of those have been successful. Some people had to stop, medical reasons. They're pregnant. It's not indicated for pregnant women, those kinds of things, but very successful. And we've been able to partner with a lot of different groups, the local detention facility, the mental health care provider, Intrust, local physicians who also are providers for us, certainly with the Secretary Tilley's office and with VAN, other medical providers and everything. The faith community certainly provides CR services and things like that, a wide variety of partners. And the reason that this is so important is because it has an impact beyond that 101 people who've actually been able to start taking the drugs. We had our newest person just this week. Didn't hear what that was. Newest person just this week. In the last 6 months, we've had 6 people who completed 13 months of treatment. And this is not something which is court ordered. This is something which is a collaborative effort with local physicians, and they make the decision with the defendant's attorney in consultation with their client. And we get referrals now from all sorts of services, whether they're public defenders, whether they're prosecutors, and it's been extremely successful. It has challenges, none of which are particularly difficult. They may seem insurmountable at first, but they're not. They require the true desire to make a difference in a community. But the biggest one, Governor Fletcher, you mentioned already, data. We know how we've done in our program. I don't necessarily know how well this works in other areas, though we were blessed recently to have a study released by NIDA, which was a heads-up comparison between the use of naltrexone and buprenorphine in 570 subjects. And it was simply as effective as buprenorphine. But here in rural America, it offers advantages because with buprenorphine, you have to be able to get to a doctor on a regular basis. That doesn't happen so well if you live in Farmers, Kentucky, up in Rowan County and Bath County. It doesn't happen very easily if you live in Burnside, Kentucky, whereas naltrexone is a once every 28-day shot. So for us in rural America, it's extraordinarily effective. The additional challenges besides besides the lack of data involves, frankly, education. We have to educate law enforcement so this is more acceptable within the local community. Certainly judges, local physicians, and people who don't have a tremendous base of knowledge about this form of treatment. But we're very proud of the efforts which are being done by the current administration, certainly through the Department of Agriculture. SAMHSA is now partnering to bring judges and their teams from other parts of the country to look at successful naltrexone programs. We had a judge and their team from Virginia just 2 weeks ago, so they can hopefully go back and replicate this model. But extraordinarily successful, and certainly it means when we treat, we're also providing prevention, and we are also assisting law enforcement. Thank you, Madam Secretary.
Quick question before I turn to Carrie. Do you see a opportunity for more of the drug court model in a rural setting? And what what does it take for a community that has nothing? What type of resources or leadership is needed to help get that model started?
Surprisingly little. Again, we often want to create these challenges that don't really exist. You have to have somebody. Every judge in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, for example, does this on a volunteer basis. We have very little in the way of resources, though we do have a treatment coordinator, which is allocated through the state budget. But all of the other people who work drug courts, they do so on a volunteer basis. So there are educational specialists who help with things like GED, our housing specialists who help people find housing, our counselors who come, our probation officers who volunteer their time, local sheriff's departments who provide the security they're not getting reimbursed for. It is truly a collaborative and volunteer effort, and what you have to have most is you have to have leadership. And we see leadership obviously in a wide range of aspects here. For us, obviously, in the court system, it must be the judges who are dedicated to really intervening with this problem. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you. Carrie, I want to turn to you and get some better understanding of the Care to Hope project. Who are the local partners? How is that funded? What do you guys do? And can we replicate it other places?
Hello, everybody. I'm excited to be here today to speak about the Care to Hope project, which was funded just last year, and it was funded through a grant that's supported by NIDA, the CDC, SAMHSA, and the Appalachian Regional Commission. They funded 8 projects across the U.S. to address the opioid epidemic and related harms, particularly HIV, hepatitis C, and overdose. And we haven't heard a lot about HIV and hepatitis C, but those are significant problems that are facing our communities in rural areas today. The Care to Hope project is led by Drs. April Young, who is here, and she's right there, from the University of Kentucky at the Center on Drug and Alcohol Research, and also Dr. Hannah Cooper from Emory University. We heard earlier today about those 54 counties that are vulnerable, and what they're vulnerable to is HIV and hepatitis C outbreaks. And so that's one of the missions of the Care to Hope project, is to address the potential for disease transmission and what we saw happening in Scott County, Indiana. The Care to Hope project has 2 phases. The first phase is a needs assessment, and so we have built community coalition partnerships. So it's a partnership between academics and community partners. There are 9 coalitions that we're working with and have helped develop. The coalition members include the faith community, they include public health department, they include treatment practitioners, people who are in recovery, and people who are actively using drugs. So it's a very diverse group that's involved in the community coalitions. So the coalitions are designed to help identify the needs in the specific communities. We're working with 12 counties in Kentucky, in the Kentucky River and the Gateway districts, and the coalitions are participating in qualitative interviews, and then we're also doing a survey data collection with people who are actively using drugs to understand the needs from their perspective. And we're looking at needs in terms of treatment, prevention, access to medication-assisted treatments, and also syringe exchange programs. The Care to Cope project is actually out in the communities. So we have a field office in Moorhead and in Hazard. And the first phase, we're currently in the very initial stages. We're in year 1 of phase 1, which is a 2-year phased project. The second phase will be a 3-year project in which the coalitions will identify interventions that they want to implement in their communities. And so we have suggested 4 possible evidence-based interventions for them to adopt, but they can also develop their own or choose their own evidence-based interventions. The interventions that we've discussed are a mobile health services unit that would provide HIV and hepatitis C testing, also linkage to care, and also linkage to syringe exchange programs in the regions if they're available. The second is a jail-based program, which would work with a health navigator to link people up with HIV, hepatitis C testing, and also overdose prevention, and also, again, linkages to care. The third possible intervention is a pharmacy-based initiative to improve testing again. And the last is a training for healthcare providers to improve access to effective medication-assisted treatment. So far, the coalitions and the survey data from the people who are using drugs have really been endorsing the first two possible evidence-based interventions, the ones working with jail reentry and then the mobile services unit. So we're excited to see how those will roll out and how they will fare. We're doing a stepwise wedged randomized trial design, so we will be able to evaluate these programs scientifically. And we are also, working with the community whenever we get data to give the data back to the community. And so the coalitions have been very active and exciting when we talk about the faith-based community. One of the ideas that has arisen out of a coalition is that there would be an opioid month, awareness month, in which the faith-based leaders would devote their sermons to focusing on stigma, how to support people who have substance abuse problems, and how to facilitate reintegration. And so, in our opinion, this could be replicated in other rural communities, building these coalitions, gathering this assessment data, and then implementing these evidence-based interventions. The interventions and programs are also meant to be sustainable, and so after the grant funding and the project is gone, we'll still be able to have the programs in the communities that need them. So we have a lot of exciting things that are going on at the Center on Drug and Alcohol Research. We are also doing other studies, doing medication development trials. We are working with the Kentucky Department of Corrections to evaluate their implementation of Vivitrol and see how individuals who are in rural communities are willing to take the medication and if they continue the care after they're released back to the community. We're also working on the issue of the increasing rates of women who are incarcerated and have substance abuse problems, doing HIV interventions in jails and looking at how those interventions may reduce women's HIV risk behaviors and hepatitis C risk behaviors as they transition back to the community. And then finally, we have some educational initiatives that we're engaging in where we teach courses in local prisons, and half the students are UK students and the other half are people who are incarcerated. And these courses focus on the relationship between drugs and crime. We teach Dreamland in the course, and it's really a way to motivate and challenge people to do better once they're released. And it also gives a humanistic feel to the UK students who want to go out and become law enforcement or work in the legal profession or work in the social service sector. So, thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Before we shift to recovery, I want to go, Commissioner Howard, to you. And if you could talk, we've heard a lot today about the 220 counties and the significant number that are here in Kentucky. As we look at those at-risk counties, have you guys implemented any new activities really on the ground when we think about trying to prevent an outbreak? And then in addition, we've had some discussion today about innovation and treatment. And so do you see opportunities for that here in Kentucky that you're looking at?
Well, thank you, Secretary. Thank you for coming to Kentucky. Hilda, thank you so much for getting this wonderful event together. Most importantly, Alex, thank you for sharing your story. That's important. This truly is the crisis next door, and those stories need to get out there. Let me take 1 second before I answer that question to say Dreamland is probably the most important written work on this issue, and it is a textbook, but it's a textbook for prevention because it outlines a roadmap to understanding this disease and how it comes about. Let me tell you what I took away from Dreamland. The story was great, but to me it was a story of despair. And I really think despair is the driver of this disease. I think it's folks like Alex, many of the folks in my own family who have genetic predispositions to addiction, who are exposed to a circumstance that includes despair, that includes liking having work, et cetera, that leads to addiction. And that's what we got to focus on, and that's what we're trying to do in the Department of Public Health. In terms of answering your question, when the CDC released that report, and we learned that 54 of our counties are at risk, What that's done was quite simply define the scope of our problem here in Kentucky. And it made us realize the degree in which we have to respond, and that led to many innovative strategies, Judge Taps, drug courts across the state, et cetera, that have been very, very helpful. One of the most important innovations that came out of this are our syringe exchange programs, however. Kentucky has 46 approved syringe exchange programs, 44 active. We'll have 46 active very soon. We're second in the nation. For a state with the ideologies that are prevalent here, that is a huge accomplishment, and many states are looking to us to lead that. In fact, Indiana is calling for a conference very soon to help them. And note that Indiana is the state who really led the way with U.S. Surgeon General Jerome Adams being there when they had the HIV outbreak in Scott County. As you may know, recently in northern Kentucky, we had for the first time in the past 6 months an increase in HIV cases with the most common risk factor for disease transmission, so transmitting the disease from one person to another, being intravenous drug abuse. We were this close to having Scott County, Indiana, in northern Kentucky. I've had very, very many sleepless nights over that, and that's the reason we are focusing our attention on syringe exchange programs, and will continue in the future. And let me tell you, there's going to be some people in this room, and I was one of you many months ago, maybe a few years ago, who were hesitant on syringe exchange programs. It's not about the syringes. Yes, yes, it's in the name. Yes, they're swapping syringes, but it's about preventing the infectious complications of substance abuse disorder, which are HIV, which are hepatitis C, which are now in a current outbreak of hepatitis A that's spreading through that population. It's about sexually transmitted diseases that we can prevent. We can cut off at the source, which are destroying our communities and costing our healthcare system fortunes. We spend millions of dollars annually on hepatitis C, millions of dollars annually on HIV treatment that could be prevented via testing and treatment that can be initiated via syringe exchange programs. Also, as you heard from Secretary Tilley earlier, patients are 5 times more likely to seek treatment if they enter a syringe exchange program. Patients who come to syringe exchange programs are fundamentally different because they've recognized what they are doing has a negative impact, and they're more likely to seek treatment. So that makes them vitally important. We have really 3 touch points with folks suffering from this disorder. Either you're being arrested and you're interacting with the justice system, you're overdosing and you're in our ERs, or you're in syringe exchange programs. They're extremely difficult, and we cannot afford to let that touch point go by without engaging these patients. So I hope we continue to expand syringe exchanges across the state. That is probably the most important innovation that we see coming across the country, because we are doing a very good job, I think, of beginning to address from a justice perspective with Vanna Ingram and Secretary Tilley's leadership. We are doing a very good job with getting folks who overdose into care. Alan Brenzel and Tina Robbins from our Behavioral Health Department has worked very hard to do bridge clinics. Bridge clinics are when a patient comes into the ER and they overdose, we immediately offer them a chance to go to treatment right then, no questions asked. And that's what we have to do. We have to continue to push that, and we've seen tremendous success with those sort of treatment mechanisms. I will echo Governor Fletcher's points. We've got to have better data. I know with the $3 billion of funding, a significant amount of that money is going to go to the CDC, which is going to give us more robust surveillance data. One more comment about adverse childhood events. We have to stop adverse childhood events. It's a difficult dilemma to be in, however, because one, if we leave a child in a home with drug-addicted parents, that's an adverse childhood event. If we pull that child out of the home, that's an adverse childhood event. So we have to work closely with these families, and I would challenge us to have. It's a very, very difficult situation that we're dealing with, how to get those children treated appropriately. There's a whole population of kids in this state and across the country who are in a vicious cycle of addiction, and they're not DCBS cases, they're not child protective cases, but they are children of addicted parents who are just waiting, and they're thinking, well, my mom and dad got treatment, great, or they come through your drug court, but when's the next time? Is it going to be 2 years from now that our electricity's cut off, we've lost our home? And that is a significant strain on our society now, and a significant cause for future addiction that we are not addressing yet. We're hoping to address in Kentucky and at a federal level. I had that conversation with Secretary Azar, who understands that very, very well. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Howard. With that, I want to shift to recovery. I think while there's no silver bullet in this very complex issue, we know that community is essential to long-term prosperity. for many struggling families. And I think that will look different in each community where the assets and the needs often differ. However, a strong recovery network is so important to keeping people healthy. Judge Choate, I'd like to start with you. You have been a tremendous partner to us, working with Hilda directly on some of the issues that we see with respect to housing, and look forward to continuing to work with you on those challenges. Can you talk a bit about the Foothills Academy project? Why was it created? And what are some of the needs that you see with the youth that you get to interact with in that project?
Sure, I'll be happy to. Many years ago, I found myself as a 27-year-old district judge, and one of my most unpleasant tasks was to remove, in 3 rural counties here in Kentucky, and one of my most unpleasant tasks was to remove kids from terrible homes and for neglect or abuse. And so in doing that, we would find, with the help of DCBS or whatever, we'd find placements for some of them, but not all. And you could always find a foster home for a sweet 6-year-old. A teenage boy, something else. Because if you've been abused all your life, then you come with a lot of baggage. And so we have to deal with that. This group of kids would go through various foster facilities, maybe stay with a parent, stay with a relative, then foster facilities, and they kind of fell their way out of the system. And we had no place to put those. So I thought that that was just unacceptable. I went ahead and created a nonprofit and wandered around for about 10 years trying to get something going. There was a piece of property in my hometown in Clinton County, Kentucky, in Albany, that was the largest underground marijuana operation in the nation at that time. Okay, it had been forfeited to the federal government, and through a convoluted set of facts that would take much too long to explain, the state received the property, and I got a lease on that property to develop it. I partnered in getting this going. I thought I'd have a place for 12 boys from my court. That turned out to be a very poor business model. You can't really do it with 12. At that point in time, I didn't know what a financial statement was, so it didn't really matter. I wandered around more, and there's probably not an agency in the room that I haven't begged money from and gotten some from most of you, most of which are USDA, Highlands, Lake Cumberland Ad Program, Federal Home Loan Bank, Kentucky Housing, the list goes on and on and on. Okay. We converted the properties and received 12 boys quickly through the state, was licensed, created an environment where in a cottage there would be 12 kids in each cottage. They would have a master's level or above licensed therapist that only worked with those 12. And I thought, this is great. Only the need kept growing and growing. So not to bore you with all of the details, but 18 years later, I have 72 boys that live there full time. We have our own high school on site, our own vocational schools on site. 8 years ago, or about 10 years ago, I guess now, I was approached to see if they would, our success rates were really good, and to see if we could make it a co-ed facility because there was nowhere for girls. All my staff threatened to quit if I did that quickly. So through 11 different partnerships and 11 separate funding agencies, we built a place called the Otter Creek Academy for Girls. And it's a 48-bed girls facility now. And over the years, we have seen the type of kids that we get change drastically. 90% of 90+% of the kids initially were there because of their parents and an addiction issue. Now we're seeing more of the kids with the addiction issues. So within the last 2 years, we've opened a separate and distinct unit on one of the campuses for 12 boys as a residential juvenile program, recovery program. All of it evidence-based and all of that with a licensed counselor. All of our residents go through the comprehensive drug and alcohol treatment, but then the separate unit is for those with more severe addiction problems. It was kind of unique. 2 things. One, I talked about trying to get money for all of this. I got very little at that point in time for kids, almost none, actually. But I did get money for economic development because we live in a very, very poor area. So I changed the focus of not what I was going to do, but the focus of how I presented it, and that seemed to work out pretty well. We're the second largest. Now we're the second, and unfortunately, I mean, I'm from a very poor place, so I'm the second largest employer there. I mean, with 170 employees over 2 campuses, we have a comprehensive outpatient program to do follow-up on the kids that leave our programs, and it's been very interesting to see the evolution of the kids. 20 years ago, when I was talking to a group from DJJ about this, one of the ladies spoke up and said, and I was looking for places for kids that I had to remove. One of the ladies spoke up and said, "There's a weird phenomenon going on in California I've been reading about." Said, "There's kids stealing their parents' pain pills and crushing them and snorting them." And nobody in Kentucky had heard of that. And that's only been 20 years. That's not very long. But we keep, we have about 160 boys a year that goes through Foothills, another 80 girls that goes to that. We're having a tremendous amount of girls that are moms, and that adds additional strain on problems. Our big needs, and what I'm trying to do now, and I think this is something lacking in our system, is when one of the residents becomes 18, we try to make sure that no one leaves there without an employable skill. Every child gets a comprehensive treatment plan that we review weekly with a therapist, a vocational plan, complete psychological, to see what they're capable of doing, what their interests are, and none of them leaves one of my facilities without an employable skill. If they're not going to college, they can go ahead and get college credit on campus, but I want them to leave if they aren't going to go to college, if they aren't going to go to the military, and we use that a lot, I don't want them to leave without an employable skill. You know, my worst fear is for them to have an entry-level minimum wage job. The problem is, though, many of these youth have no one on their contact list. There is not a parent, there is not a guardian, there is not another human being on earth that is concerned about them. So it's our job to create that, and we try to, and that's where the individual treatment program comes for. That we start. When they're admitted, we start trying to see their exit strategy at that day, and we review that every week and try to do that. It doesn't come without its challenges. As I say, they bring a lot of baggage with them, but it's really rewarding work. There. Thanks.
Thank you for your leadership. I want to turn next to Tim. We often hear that the journey in recovery can be quite challenging. As a person comes out of that treatment and they move into that lifelong process of recovery, there can be challenges in everyday life, certainly, but the challenges are particularly strong with respect to things like housing, employment services. What challenges have you seen people in recovery face when they go to reintegrate into that normal life, and how do you think that transition can be improved? And I guess as you touch on that, can you tell us a bit about the Addiction Recovery Care Project? Why was this created? How does it work, and can it be replicated?
It was created because I was a fall-down drunk who got sober, and that was 11 years ago this past December. I was actually a prosecutor in our town in Louisa, Kentucky, and a court bailiff who was a pastor led me to a spiritual awakening at my desk. And it wasn't just that happened in my life. My faith became the foundation. But he had been a recovering alcoholic, and he walked with me for the next 6 months to a year of my life and helped me walk out my recovery. And because of that, now, this year I'll celebrate 12 years. And so I want to start by saying we're glad to have you in Kentucky. And even though a lot of these numbers paint a dismal picture, I believe you're sitting in the state that is the laboratory for solutions to the opioid crisis for the nation. And I say that because it's already been said, our congressman from where I live, Hal Rogers, has been a national leader, not only with Unite, but the most impressive event, and I go to a lot of them annually, is the National Prescription Drug Summit. Recently, within the last 2 weeks, our senior senator, the majority leader, sponsored the Career Act, which is going to provide dollars. And I was at a roundtable related to that, and I said, this is a very big deal when we start investing in job training for recovering addicts. And then finally, I'll say, too, is that our governor, Matt Bevins, has made Kentucky a second chance state, and he is being assisted in that by our Justice Secretary Tilley that had to leave. And then, and I say this everywhere we are, we got the best Office of Drug Control Director in the nation in Van Ingram, to the extent that recently a friend of mine called last year and said, West Virginia has named a new Office of Drug Control Policy Director. What should they do? And I said, you need to tell him to go to Kentucky and spend the day with Van Ingram and do what he tells him. And so we've got really national leaders, state leaders on this issue. And most importantly, what happened, and a lot of this was Secretary Tilley, Van Ingram, Dr. Brenzels, and others, we started a Medicaid benefit for all levels of addiction care, including residential treatment, in the summer of 2014, which made Kentucky the first of all the Appalachian states to do that. And since then, and our organization was the first to admit a residential Medicaid patient to residential treatment in the state. Since then, in January 2015, we've been able to treat 4,000 Medicaid members in rural Kentucky that had an addiction issue. And in that process, we've built 14 treatment centers in some of the most rural parts of our state, towns like Annville, towns like Benham and Harlan County, and we're delivering world-class care in rural Kentucky. And of those 14 centers, we've created 300 jobs. 150 of those are folks in recovery. I don't have to look anywhere else but my payroll to see that second chance employment works. And of those 300, 100 are graduates of our program. And one of the reasons that I believe we've been successful is because we've approached this. You know, you said earlier there's no silver bullet, but we've been successful because we approached this holistically. So on the medical side, we have an addictionologist that runs our medical programs. We have nurse practitioners and doctors doing their piece. We also are nationally accredited by CARF, so we're a center of clinical excellence. We started out as a grassroots ministry that grew up to a treatment center, but we've never changed that foundation. And so just like what we see with Catholic healthcare systems and other faith-based groups, we still have today pastoral counselors. We still have chaplains, and most importantly, in addition to going outside for AANA, we also go out to church, and we also go out to celebrate recovery. And so that holistic approach has really created a synergy. But I tell you, the most significant thing that we've done is when we said, okay, we're going to treat this medically, clinically, and spiritually, but the big breakthrough came when we said we're going to treat this vocationally. And we launched with partnership of our workforce board, East Kentucky Concentrated Employment. We got the best one of those here in Eastern Kentucky in the country. And Jeff Whitehead and that group helped us give us seed funding for that. And we created a peer support specialist academy, partnered with Sullivan University that has a learning center in our town. And we created a 9-month training program that literally takes somebody from crisis to career. And we were able to work with Sullivan to give them college credit for that. They became a certified peer support specialist. And the results were anything beyond what we could have imagined. Today, the first class that started in October of 16, that graduated in May of 17, the first class today, 87.5%, 14 of 16 today are 2 years clean and sober. They're working, they're paying taxes, they've transitioned off Medicaid, and are not just in entry-level jobs. We have folks in that class now that are directors of centers for us and our leaders. the thing that happened when we offered crisis to career is our treatment motivation doubled, and the number of folks that decided to go from phase 1, basically detox residential, to phase 2, sober living and intensive outpatient, that number doubled. It doubled. In fact, it created a big bottleneck for us because we didn't have enough phase 2 beds, but what a problem to have. So in seeing that was the most transformative thing in our soon-be 10 years doing this, we've added other job training programs, one that started a week or so ago. And we're blessed in Eastern Kentucky with the leadership of our congressman and Hilda and others who've worked on this to have broadband in certain areas. So we created a virtual halfway house in Louisa where people will be able to stay there, get telework training. They'll earn 4 certifications, and they'll be able to take advantage of the hundreds of thousands of jobs that are online. It's been very, very popular, or very, very successful. EKCEP last year created 150 jobs in Owsley County, which is the poorest county in our state. And so this is actually going better. We've only been open 2 weeks, and last week our first 4 telework recovering addicts went to job fair, and 3 of them got offered jobs. And the reason this is so significant is there's such a gap in reentry programs of when somebody gets out of treatment and they start work. And what this represents is in many parts of our country, the rural parts of America, we don't have public transportation. We lack child care facilities, and we don't have entry-level jobs. So a model like this will allow us to have virtual halfway houses in some of the poorest, most remote places. And give folks an opportunity, because I can tell you, I don't work with anybody in recovery that does not want a purpose, that doesn't want the dignity of working. And so thank you again for being in Kentucky, and as you all make investments, making sure that we meet this human capital crisis of our time being driven by addiction, I think is one of the biggest investments you should make.
Thank you, Tim, so much for those insightful comments. I agree with so much of what you have shared today. I'm going to turn to Ernie in the interest of time to tell us a bit about the Recovery Kentucky, that initiative. How did you find partners to launch it? And I will note this is an abstinence-based program, and are there some key challenges that come with that position, or can you talk a bit about that? We've heard a lot about medically assisted treatment today, and I know there's another side that you see in this discussion.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Let me say that one size doesn't fit all. There's a spectrum of treatments. So to think that there is one single solution that has all the answers is probably a little naive given where people enter. Tim, I want to say thanks. You and I probably share a lot, and we don't know it, but we will. Recovery Kentucky was started back when I was governor. I appointed a very innovative, brilliant business guy by the name of Don Ball. He had already worked with the Hope Center in Lexington, the Healing Place in Louisville, as a model. It was a model that was provenly effective. And he came to me, and he put together multiple funding streams and said, Ernie, your governor, here's what I'd like to do. I said, this looks wonderful. I was on the drug task force in Congress, and we'd written some methadone years ago in clinic, and we'd done some work, but this looked like something that would really work. So I said, go ahead, build 11 of them. And Judge, I want to say thanks because of leadership of folks like you. You helped provide the insight from the Department of Corrections to get those folks in, and we'll talk about that in just a minute and try to answer your question. What we have now, and I want to go just to the end of it, we have the 18th Center opening. At any one point, we have over 2,000 people, probably close to 3,600 to 4,000 a year that graduate from this, and I say graduate. Now, what it is a 12-step. It's not, I would say it's a treatment, but it's really a recovery because it deals with a holistic approach, just like you all were doing, Tim, and it changes people's lives. It gives them a purpose in life. And if you can hear the testimonies, and Secretary Hazlett, you've heard them in the center in Bowling Green, Kentucky. all I want to say from that standpoint is that, yeah, medication-assisted treatment, it has a very important role. I heard Secretary Azar, they're putting, he said $6 billion at that time into MAT, and it one size doesn't fit all, but we have to have a spectrum of treatment and approaches because there are a spectrum of people that are affected by this. But Recovery Kentucky works. So Don Ball came to me a few months ago and said, Ernie, we want to take this nationally because it works. And he did it philanthropically, had absolutely no personal gain from this at all. And so I said, well, I'll help you. Well, he went on to get more ill, and then he said, Ernie, you're going to have to do it because I can't. And then he passed away just a few weeks ago. But Myra has established, we've got a Fletcher group, which is we work with addiction, whether in lifestyle diseases, health and well-being. Part of it, we're looking at a task force of getting to the root causes and some of the public health approach with data and analytics. The other part is the Don Ball Foundation of Recovery Hope. So we're working on Recovery USA to take this nationally. We're going to do everything we can to take it nationally. We're working with faith-based groups like Mike Beatty back there. We've already touched base with him. Why is it important? Because it's part of the full spectrum of treatment. It works, it's 12-step, it's peer support. It provides a tremendous amount of economic development. You can put them any place you've got a good sponsor. It needs really three things. It needs leadership, somebody who wants to do it. And as we go to other states, it's important to have a governor that wants to do it, and it's important to have the national folks out of USDA, and we thank you, and Renee, Congresswoman Renee, we thank you for your leadership in this. But you got to have leadership. You got to have somebody saying, yes, we want to do this. 2, you've got to have a sponsor. You've got to have somebody in a community that wants to take this and run with it. And 3, you've got to have the technical know-how to do this. What we're doing is providing that technical know-how, identifying sponsors. What is the challenge with identifying sponsors? Most of the time, you've got a lot of folks that are interested in this, whether they're faith-based groups or other community organizations that want to do something. Generally, they don't know, where do we get the resources? And let me say, Judge Choate, I visited your facility a number of years ago. I'm glad to hear it's gone well and grown. But it takes that leadership, and there's sponsors in the communities that want to do it. What we can do is to bring the know-how, a toolkit to show you how to do it from soup to nuts. It has all the funding stream there that's available. Now, you've got to have the leadership in the state, HUD, making sure that they can do that. But we take the federal home loan. We take low-income tax credits. We take Section 8 housing. We take food stamps. We take community development block grants. We take a per diem from Department of Corrections. And 70-some% of our residents now are from the Department of Corrections. It's all voluntary. Those 74%, you can usually volunteer to either stay or they can deal with the judge after that. 38% are homeless, and the results are absolutely astounding. 84% is our efficacy rate, and it matches very close to what you're doing, Tim, because I think we're doing very similar stuff. Now, we outsource a lot of the medical treatment on that, and we have some FQHCs in a couple of centers. 94% of heroin addicts are free at 1 year. That exceeds anything, even medication-assisted treatment, by the way. Now, that's done by and I'll give the UK Drug and Alcohol Research Center does our stats on that. You all do a fantastic job. We want to get with you and talk about make sure that we continue to get that data. But it needs that technical assistance, and we can do that. So let me just say this, and there are some barriers. There's not in my backyard that we have to deal with. But once we become communities and they see the economic impact, and Bowling Green, we saw that there was a not in my backyard. Now the community has embraced this center because these are folks that contribute to the community. Each center is anywhere from $6 to $10 million to build. It's a $1.2 to $1.5 million operating expense. That goes back into the economy. And if you know anything that goes back in there, it's a 5-6 times ratio when you look at economic development. I don't know if I've answered your question, but if you're interested, give me your card. We're going to take this nationally because it works. And we're going to work with all the other aspects of treatment across the spectrum because there is not a one-size-fits-all. but we're certainly a part of it that's worked, and I know Don Ball would love to be here. Thank you, Ann, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Governor, and thank you for your leadership. Shelley and Alex, I would like to actually put the last question with you. I look at your family, and I think that it's very fitting to end with the two of you because you bring great hope to this conversation. When we look at how your family has turned the struggle into really a mission. Alex, I want to start with you and just ask if you could elaborate a bit about some of the barriers when we think about somebody transitioning from treatment into that long-term, lifelong recovery process. What were some of the barriers that you faced as a person in long-term recovery?
Yeah, thank you. I want to start by saying what a meaningful experience it is to get to sit here next to my mom, who has been my biggest advocate and who loved me the hardest when I was the hardest to love. And it's a really redeeming experience to get to sit here and do this with her. So I'm glad to be here with you. After I do speaking engagements, I was in Louisville yesterday speaking at a conference, and afterwards people come up to me and they say really, really nice things. And they say, Alex, we're so proud of you because you're so strong and you're so brave, and on and on. And my ego desperately wants those to be true, but the reality is that's not the truth. I'm not in recovery today because of anything that has to do with me. I'm not in recovery today because I made a choice to enter recovery. I'm not in recovery today because I willed it to be. That belies everything that we understand about the true nature of substance use disorders. Because what we know, whether you look at a NIDA definition, a SAMHSA definition, a DSM-5 definition, we know that substance use disorders are by definition chronic disorders of the brain. That operative term being chronic. And so by virtue of being chronic disorders, they have to be treated like other chronic disorders. They have to be managed over the over a person's lifetime. You think about, like diabetes, a person can't take insulin one time and cure their diabetes. They have to manage it on a daily basis. And the same is true of substance use disorders. And so to answer your question, even though I went to a 6-month inpatient long-term treatment center, when I walked out 6 months and a day in recovery, I wasn't cured, because that's not the way that substance use disorders work. I still had to find a way to manage my disorder on a daily basis. And so I walked straight out of that 6 months of inpatient care into an intensive outpatient program where I had group therapy and additional accountability. I went to a 12-step program for peer support, went to individual counseling to address my anxiety. We went to family counseling to address some sort of maladaptive patterns of interaction that we had. When I left the Salvation Army, I had a criminal record. I had bad credit. I had lots of debt. There weren't a lot of people jumping up and down trying to give me jobs or a place to stay. So I was lucky to have the opportunity to stay. Even though I qualified financially for Section 8 housing, I was disqualified by virtue of my drug trafficking charge. These are immense barriers to recovery, and it's unfortunate that the narrative when we send people out of treatment is sort of platitudes like don't think, don't drink, go to meetings. Totally not acknowledging all the barriers that a person faces. And so that's sort of the fundamental philosophy that we took with Voices of Hope, our 501c3 nonprofit organization. Is there are so many folks here doing phenomenal work with promotion and prevention and treatment, but it's all for naught if we abandon people in their time of greatest need right after treatment. And so what Voices of Hope does is try to amplify and maximize the return on investment that folks are doing with treatment and prevention. And that's by things like a program of telephone recovery support, where volunteers make weekly calls to people who are in recovery that really just pivot on the question, how can I help you with your recovery today? And they offer that much needed social and emotional support and connect people to resources wherever possible. We're piloting a program of recovery coaching to help people overcome some of those barriers to health and wellness goals. Our long-term big dream is to create a recovery community center, which is not to be confused with a treatment center. It's not a place to do primary treatment, but it's really and truly a community center for people in recovery, a safe space for people to engage in life skills programming and have yoga classes and to engage with one another. And so I'll close by saying this. If we continue to make the mistake of mismatching a chronic disorder with an acute care model, the inevitable result will be relapse rates that are far too high and a continual increase in overdose rates. The inevitable result. But if we find a way to match appropriately a chronic disorder with chronic management, I think maybe more young people will get the opportunity to sit at a round table with their mom and experience that. So, thanks.
Shelley, can I call on you to give a perspective maybe of what it was like in this journey with your son?
Sure. I really hate talking after Alex. For a quick family perspective, my story starts with eyebrows. When Alex was 10, we went out of town to visit family. My 8-year-old nephew said, "Aunt Shelley, what's happened to Alex's eyebrows?" And I looked, and he had 2 little spots. They were gone. I didn't not know about his disappearing eyebrows because I was an absent mother. It's not because I didn't care. It's because I was there, and I couldn't see him losing hair by hair day after day. This is what addiction's like. It's insidious. It stole his soul, hair by hair. He was a baseball player. He was earning his starting spot, and he quit baseball to become a manager. He quit being a manager because it made him too anxious. He quit calling me and telling me what he learned in school that day at center. Then he stopped reading books. I watched my son slide away, and I didn't know what it was. This is what it's like for family. The hope that you get when they finally enter a treatment facility, the despair when the day after they relapse. The knowledge that I get now, which is that we need recovery resources. We need support post-treatment. It's such an important time. People who leave residential recovery are 35 times more likely to overdose. I didn't know this. I needed to know this. I couldn't find a book about this. That's how I got all my information. That's my story. I so appreciate this. I so want to advocate for those recovery resources and resources for families because we're important.
Well, I'm going to just offer just some closing thoughts and then hand things over to the president of Berea College. Thank you so much for joining us today and for the hospitality and all that went into the logistics of this. Just such a wonderful setting, and we're incredibly grateful for you hosting us and opening up your doors. I guess I'll just close with going back to where we started this morning or this afternoon, which is thanking everyone for being here, for being willing to share your stories and the piece of this puzzle that you've brought to the table. I'm very grateful to our State Director, Hilda Legg, and the leadership of she and her team here. I'm grateful for the members of the congressional delegation in Kentucky. You have such strong leaders here, and I couldn't agree more, Tim, with your comment that this is really a state that can be a lab for innovation, and a lot of that comes from the leadership and the passion that is here, and the pride that people have in this state. You can feel it, and I'm very grateful for getting to learn from you today. I want you to know that we have been a partner to rural America for many generations through many issues. We see this as no different. So we at Rural Development and at the Department of Agriculture are here to walk with communities, to offer the resources that we have. There's been some references to Indiana today. That, again, is my home state. I'm very proud to be from that place. I'm very proud of the work that has gone on in response to some of the activity in Scott County. I've really seen it as a crisis that has brought leaders together in that community to rally in a new way, not just to get the drugs out of their town, but to really set a vision for the future. And I have no doubt that that can happen in Kentucky. With the references to Indiana today, I'm going to close just with a thought from our current governor in Indiana, a tremendous leader in this area, a man named Eric Holcomb. And he and I often will talk back and forth about what he describes this as being a battle for life. And I think that's such an accurate description. I want you to know that at USDA we stand with you in this battle, and we know that working together we can not only address this epidemic, but make sure that our small towns are places for prosperity for generations to come. So again, thank you for your attendance today, and I'm going to hand the mic over to President Ruloff. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Secretary Hazlett, and thank you, all of you, panelists and audience members, for coming to show you care about this issue and to be part of the search for solutions. And it's truly exciting to have reason for hope and optimism based on what I've heard today. I apologize for arriving late due to my travel schedule, and I'm regretful too because everything I heard was very inspiring, and as I said, brings hope to a region. Berea College has been providing opportunity regardless of the means of students since our founding more than a century and a half ago. But substance abuse has made that challenge of interrupting the cycle of poverty one student at a time more difficult. Substance abuse certainly deepens the cycle of poverty. There are students who should be coming to Berea College for whom it's not an option because they might be the only resource a family has that's holding itself together. The sad fact of substance abuse is one of those factors that both feeds the cycle of poverty and, I believe, results from the cycle of poverty. And therefore, the kinds of broad-based solutions that we've heard described here today have to be the sorts of things we undertake. I want to affirm, just based on our experience here in Madison County, the terrible impact on the local court systems and jails. We are being overwhelmed by this problem, even as we face other challenges. I want to affirm, too, wisdom that has become second nature to us here at Berea College, that solutions do have to emerge locally to this. There's tremendous variation in the problem, and the leadership does have to emerge locally, even though resources are needed. That has always been our model here. Several Bereans who work on connecting to the region are present with us. Rodney Wolfenbarger in the far back may have been introduced already. Rodney, would you raise your hand? Rodney is in charge of our effort to support the communities of Appalachia and Eastern Kentucky, always working to strengthen local leadership. I just want to say again that disconnecting substance abuse from the underlying disease of poverty, I think, is mistaken. It is rather opioid abuse appears to be the last symptom that emerges from that underlying disease. Symptoms like food insecurity, family breakdown, sustained dependency. And these are all areas that both affect our students here at Berea College and pose challenges for us. So I would end just with a question. Are we dealing with victims or criminals here? Probably both, but I think first and foremost victims. So I'm very moved by the efforts in working on recovery and in supporting victims, not just to get them out of jail and through recovery, but for the lifetime of work that takes. So thank you all very much, and thank you for blessing Berea College by choosing this location to be where you gathered. And finally, I want to just give a little shout out to our tech team, those who were not able to be here but wanted to see the event live streamed or online. That was possible because of Vernon and Kyle and the other members of this team. So thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone. Again, none of this would have been possible without Anne Hazlett. So please, again, say thank you, and we look forward to the other group discussion. Travel safe home.